Welcome to another MassMEDIC virtual program. We're very excited to have you joining us for our 3-hour program on FDA updates and previews for this year. I am Rachel Robinson, Chief Operating Officer of MassMEDIC, and as I said, it's wonderful to see you all again and have you participating with us. So as I said, this will be a 3-hour program. We have a ton of information to get through. And as most of you should have realized by now, this program has no charge and is free. And we can do that and have excellent speakers because of our sponsors. And I'd just like to take a moment to recognize them. Veeva, Medtech, RQM+, Duane Morris, and Covington are our series sponsors for this program. That means they're sponsoring this program and then the hybrid program we'll be having in the fall. So we hope you will join us for that as well. But we could not do these programs without our outstanding sponsors and our excellent partners. So I just wanted to take a moment to highlight them. You're going to be hearing from a lot of them today. They're bringing you this fantastic content, including our first session, which I am going to kick over to very quickly by saying welcome to Anameen Pullen and Jennifer Kerr. I'm very excited to hear what they have to say about regulatory transformation, and I'm going to turn things over to Anameen.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And I'm going to share the screen and start the presentation. There we go. So again, good morning, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining today's MassMEDIC event. Now, in this session, we will be discussing regulatory transformation in MedTech, and we put a specific emphasis on the journey that Cook Research is undertaking. So, by way of introduction, my name is Anameen Pullen, Senior Director MedTech Strategy for Europe for Veeva Systems, and I'm very proud to have Jennifer Kerr with us in this session. Now, Jennifer has been involved in clinical research and regulatory affairs for more than 25 years. She's the president of Cook Research Incorporated, and Jennifer also serves as Cook Medical's global leader for clinical affairs and is a member of the executive leadership team. Thank you, Jennifer, so much for joining us today. So we wanted to start with a little bit of laying the foundation for digital transformation in the MedTech industry. There are a number of transformative challenges, I think, that we're all aware of and that the industry is currently facing, and that all lead to the need for digital transformation. Now, first, of course, there's the significant regulatory changes with the MDR and IVDR in the EU and the device divisionization in the US. Now, all ask basically for a different way of working compared to the more traditional ways in which MedTech has historically operated. And of course, the COVID pandemic influenced our industry with, on the one hand, the reduction of surgical procedures, while on the other hand, we saw a strong rise of the need for diagnostics. Now, in either cases, knowing exactly where certain products are registered, where products are in the supply chain, but also the ability to operate remotely without disturbing the day-to-day business has been key. And that also meant that the need for digital transformation is becoming more clear. Finally, we expect a peak in M&A activity this year, the next year, and the coming years, really to also adjust for the impact that COVID had on the pipeline. And that creates a need, but also an opportunity for harmonization and digitization across various organizational departments, pre and post M&A. However, companies approach this in very different ways. So there are companies, one hand, that consider this more as a distraction or an obstruction from business as usual. These organizations transform through a reactive approach that is more focused on short-term remediation, short-term program objectives, and technology is really just used to support short-term remediation. Now, on the other hand of the spectrum, and that's why we focus on more today, are organizations that consider change as a catalyst for transformation. They monitor the industry developments and dynamics in a very proactive way. They define the long-term strategy that drives change, not only in technology, but also in policies and processes and the technology as the environment changes. And they use an integrated IT system landscape. They are very data-driven, and that also enables them to make faster real-time decisions. So digital transformation in this setting is really about rethinking old operating models. to be more flexible, respond to changing industry requirements and customers and competitors. And this implies that digital transformation is not only about technology, but it's rather about how technology works hand in hand with the business, people skills, the organization, and its processes. The digital transformation strategy is based on an organization's strategic priorities and ambitions of the organization, like speed to market, a competitive advantage, or compliance. And this really defines also the different initiatives around digitization within, but maybe even more importantly, also across functional areas. But all of that is only possible if there's a strong foundation or cross-functional enablers that really enable that transformation. And a few examples are, for instance, organizational processes. They need to be harmonized to cover relevant processes in transformation, like, for instance, change management. Also have to make sure that you have the appropriate technology selected and implemented in a unified and connected IT landscape. Resources, of course, people, but also budget. And last example is also competencies and skills. So really making sure that the people are trained and that they know how to execute those new ways of working. So as said, defining the strategic priorities and the ambitions is really the first step in the transformation business case. Now, Medtech organizations and the leadership of these organizations really need to ask themselves, again, why do we want and why do we need to change? What are our key business drivers? Now, often these drivers are more around accelerating pipeline rollout to stimulate growth or to improve margins. And equally important in defining the drivers is also to understand what the expected business benefits should be. And clear business benefits that I think many of the Medtech organizations really strive for are efficiencies through process improvements, IT simplification, more unified and connected IT landscape, and also cross-functional collaboration, including cross-functional metrics. Those are things that we often hear. Now, to better understand regulatory transformation in Medtech, assisted on an extensive benchmark study across close to 100 global Medtech organizations. And some of the characteristics of those organizations you can see there on the left-hand side. As you can see, it's both device diagnostics, enterprise, and SMB, and EU, UK, and also North America. Now, what we found is, and this is all their current state, now what we found is that only 31% of organizations currently have a global RIM system in place. So managing, planning, and tracking of submissions, but also health authority interactions is still done manually through various disconnected tools in the majority of the cases. This means that in a vast majority of organizations, highly skilled regulatory professionals are spending precious time on administrative tasks and searching for information, which is slowing down speed to market, but also harms some of the first mover advantage. Also, all that manual work and the disconnected tools present a risk of non-compliance due to human error. So that's more the current situation in these in the organizations that participated in this study. Now, if you go a little bit more forward-looking, and when we ask you what's the future then of regulatory operations, and what is your vision on that? These organizations are, I would say, almost in violent agreement with each other, because without exception, all respondents indicated the importance of harmonized processes for end-to-end visibility of regulatory operations, a global centralized RIM system to support cross-functional collaboration and act also as a single source of truth, and finally, digitization to increase data reliability and the ability also for data-driven decision-making. Now, with that said, and with that foundation, I would say, laid, I would really like to pivot to our fireside chat with Jennifer Kerr, and to hear from her how Cook Research is approaching digital transformation. I'm gonna stop sharing. So Welcome, Jennifer. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really excited to have you. So maybe first question, just listening to all of this. We know that Cook Research is really in the middle also of this transformation. Can you share a few insights on how you have approached digital transformation in your organization and your perspective on that?
Well, first, thank you for your invitation to join this morning. Very much appreciate the opportunity just to share a little bit of perspective. Honestly, I wonder, Anamine, if you were already inside my head when you gave your presentation, because everything that you were saying was resonating with me with regard to a transformation. The company that I'm involved in with Cook's clinical research area is we're part of the bigger process, the bigger business of the organization. And as you said, we're all in different phases of that transformation. And the transformation is really based in the maturity of the different parts of our business. When that particular part is ready to embrace and move to a digital platform. For us locally at Cook Research, we started that transformation in 2012, 2013. And what is really important to understand is transformation is, it's not an end, it's really very comparable to total product lifecycle management. When you embrace digital platforms, that you really need to understand where are you in that life cycle. And are you at the beginning of using that platform? Are you at the middle of it? Or are you at the end and you're getting ready to phase to something else? So I really kind of think of it more of like an evolution. Because as we evolve, our understanding, our experiences, our capabilities begin to mature as well.
No, that's great insight. And you said, okay, well, really looking at the different parts of the organization and how mature they are, and if they are really ready, maybe for that change. How have you assessed it, or how have you recognized, well, this is the need for change? Maybe some parts of the organization need a little bit more support than others. How do you assess that?
You know, I guess it could be boiled down to simply being like an impact analysis or a risk benefit analysis of, for example, if an organization is looking to bring in a tool for HR, you know, what are the benefits of having that tool? Maybe you need to take into account the size of your organization or where your footprint is versus what are the risk of bringing it in at that particular time. So you really have to look at it from a very holistic view of being able to say, you know, where are our compliance risk high? Is there a legal reason for moving to a particular platform? So there's just a number of different things to take into account.
Yeah, no, thank you. And yeah, you mentioned, okay, well, this transformation is really more like an evolution for, I would say, more the traditional functions, maybe in the organization or the organization as a whole. So from that perspective, as when we say, well, it's more an evolution, then what does an organization actually need to consider then when preparing to transform and implement modern systems in that evolution?
I would say going back and looking at different implementations that I've been involved in, or at least involved maybe from a view looking in, is probably that we didn't spend enough time planning and really putting in the work at the very beginning. I think that we've all heard the term start with the end in mind. And that is really critical because, in one of your messages, you mentioned, what are the distractions versus, those drivers. If you have a short-term vision for, well, we're going to implement this tool, and you're reacting in that sense, you're going to get short-term gains. You're not going to get the investment and that long-term gain of that particular platform. So really understanding where we need to go as an organization. What is that long-term goal? Also recognizing that really every aspect of your organization needs to be taken into consideration, right? I mean, they really are connected in multiple ways, or if you look at it from a Venn diagram, a lot of different overlaps from that standpoint. But I think that the one that is we're really embracing more so now than ever across the organization is this idea of change management, and recognizing that in the principles of change management, it's about human behavior. It's about human reaction. We can all assume that, or we can all think, I guess we could say it that way. Oh, everybody's going to love this tool. It's great. It's so easy to use. I can click here and this information is going to come out, and oh, look at that graph. I mean, that's exciting stuff. For some, that can be absolutely terrifying. For others, it can also be a challenge when teams are very rooted in particular procedures and particular processes. And so you can't spend enough time in really kind of dissecting that out and really understanding what that impact is going to be, and address those as you can. We're never going to get 100% consensus. That's not going to be the case, but at least we are aware, eyes are open to it, and we're not surprised by, oh, I didn't expect that to occur that particular way. So it really is about a lot with human behavior.
And then how do you bring basically the human behavior also, say, more in terms of the process and technology? Because often, of course, what you said, technology can be equally exciting, maybe as frightening for people, but there's also maybe a little bit of the resistance for change, like, well, we've always worked in this way. Does the tool or the system that is put in place support us in that same way? How have you managed that, or what's been your approach to maybe that resistance to change in Cook?
Well, have lived through that. And again, I think that we get better each time. We learn a little bit more from a previous experience. But I've seen situations where we identify a platform, and then we make all of these exceptions in using that platform to conform to our processes. When in actuality, what we need to do is we need to look at our processes and be open to the platform, understanding how the platform was designed, how it can be implemented to better support the work that needs to get done, and find those two connection points versus always customizing something. It's, we should look at those tools and say, there's a reason why those tools, those platforms are built the way that they've been built. But that is a hard lesson. And sometimes it's a lesson that you end up learning. You end up living through it, and then you have to take a step back and maybe even start over or start to undo some of those decisions along the way. Because again, you don't want to be in situations where everything is constantly being customized from that standpoint. Yeah. And that's really, and that's a really important lesson as well, is to look at solutions that you really can take off the shelf, and that they can be customized in ways to make the work easier, not customized to handcuff you into a particular platform or a particular way of doing things.
Yeah, no, that's a great lesson to share. And yeah, what you already said. Okay, it's really starting with that end in mind. Put a lot of effort in the earlier stages. Never forget maybe the change management aspects and really the human connections, but also be critical or be open to do things differently. Already a number of I would say great lessons. What additional lessons can you share with the audience that you've learned moving through the clinical transformation first and now going to regulatory?
One of the things that I think is important to understand is that I think historically we look at these platforms as being an IT tool. It's owned by IT. And again, that's a very traditional model of an IT department and what an IT team brings to a group. But really what we need to do is recognize that IT is one of the support systems in this very cross-functional team. And one of the things that we did in clinical, and now we're watching it also be mimicked in other parts of the Cook organization, is where you define a team of people who are inside of that business. So we have a team of people inside of clinical that know our processes, know how we work. And so they become experts in those platforms and they help us better understand it. And we're not solely dependent upon an IT team to help us. We're dependent upon people who know our business and are inside of it, working right alongside of us. And so to me, that is another critical piece of being able to change and recognize that IT is there, it's part of the team, but it's not the totality of a platform or a solution.
And to what extent does it then mean that the role of IT has changed in your organization?
So really the way that we have evolved is that IT has a seat at the table and provides input that says maybe it's related to the system that we're bringing in and how it can basically be bolted on or be able to communicate with other systems. They're more, I guess I would say, like an architect, is they're seeing how things are put together. They bring perhaps best practices or information from those other systems that say, well, we need to make sure that if we're going to use this tool, how does it connect to this one over here from that standpoint? But the decisions are being driven by the business, the group that's going to be using it. And that's a big change, because IT in the space that they're in, they really can't know every aspect of every part of your organization, but they can help make sure that they're listening and understanding what are your needs versus the things that you want to have, and how to help make those happen. So they're a service provider, a consultant, and an architect all at the same time.
Yeah, but that's a pretty diverse role, is coming from the traditional IT models to what you've just described.
It really is, and that's another part of change management, is also recognizing that is another team of individuals that may really struggle with that. Well, no, we need to own that. We need to be able to do all of that work, and getting them on board to say, well, this is how we can work together, and this is why we think that we can do the work from inside the business.
So maybe also with an eye on time, what what's the value that that this transformation has already brought you, if you can already see that, and what are your expected benefits for the different functions, but also across the different functions?
Some of the immediate impact that we felt was a much stronger tie from our procedures to our processes, our procedures to our platforms. And so that helped us from a compliance standpoint. Obviously, going through what we've all dealt with for the past few years, we haven't been going through probably as many audits or different types of inspections that would necessitate a lot of viewing and comparing of information processes to data in the platform. But we saw an immediate impact in a positive way of linking those things together. We also saw an immediate impact on time of and utilization of our resources. So we were able to, instead of having X number of people working on a submission, we were able to shrink that down because we could really just focus in on the information that was in front of us instead of trying to find the information in Excel spreadsheets or over on somebody's hard drive or figuring out how we're going to pass documents around. So it's going to be those immediate things that you see almost right away. And I refer to it inside of the organization. It's like an oasis. It's like you see it, you're in this desert of Excel files and manual type updates, and then you see it over there. And so everything looks really good from that standpoint. But again, it's that maturity model. As the model matures through its life cycle and people do, then the information and the value of that system gets increases, because again, you're learning how to use it, you're learning how to teach it to other people, and you are also benefiting from the improvements that are coming from a particular platform.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing. I think some great, also tangible or quantifiable benefits. So I would really like to thank you also on behalf, I think, of the whole audience for sharing all these great insights and lessons learned, and give us actually maybe a peek in the kitchen of digital transformation at Cook. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And then I'd like to hand over to you, Rachel.
Thank you both, Annemie and Jennifer. That was wonderful. And just for everyone who's kind of popping questions into the Q&A, I know our speakers kind of move through quickly, but they'll take a look at those afterwards. So since we have a number of sessions today, I would suggest you use the Q&A button. Make sure to include who your question is for. As we get later on into the program, if you want to highlight those and say this is for the RQM Plus session, etc., just so folks know who's being asked a question. I do see the question that came in for Jennifer was labeled to Jennifer, so that's perfect. But if not, we will share these questions transcripts with our speakers afterwards, so they may be able to get back to you with answers as well. So don't be disappointed if you don't get a live answer. I promise we'll do as much Q&A as we can. So thank you again, both of you. That was wonderful. Before we move over to our next session, and I will have our folks at RQM Plus get ready with slides, I did want to give just a quick update to remind everyone we will be recording this session and sharing the link for the full program with you later. So you will absolutely have access to this. We will share with you whatever slides are made available by our speakers. Most of them have said yes, they'll get us PDFs, but we'll share that with you as well afterwards. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank our partners at RAPS Boston and ASQ Medical Device Discussion Group for helping us put on this wonderful program as well. So with that, I'm going to welcome Kevin, Lisa, Nancy, Allison, and Ryan from RQM Plus for a conversation on trends in FDA approvals.
Okay, hi everybody. Do we have everybody up? All right, thank you. So Quick intro, I'm Lisa Casabian, Executive VP at RQM Plus, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on FDA trends and FDA submissions. Real quick, our panel of RQM Plus team members are Kevin Go, project engineer, former FDA CDRH lead reviewer, Nancy Morrison, executive regulatory director, Ryan Randall, senior engineer and former FDA CDRH lead reviewer, and our newest team member, Allison Komiyama, founder and principal consultant at Acknowledge RS, which is now an RQM Plus company. So we will jump right into our discussion of FDA trends. If you have any questions for our panel, please put them in the Q&A and I'll keep an eye on that. Okay, so let's get started. What is the first trend that you guys are seeing and want to talk about with FDA approvals?
I'm seeing a lot more push for de novos. So things that maybe have the same indications, same technology, but maybe there's a little twist to it, right? Like maybe you have machine learning in their software. We're seeing FDA push that into a de novo. Also, we've seen it with, same device, same indications, but maybe a different technology. Instead of allowing that to go under a normal 510K route that they might have done in the past, it's now getting pushed to a de novo.
Yeah, I think we see that reflected in the MDUFA numbers as well. Like if you look all the way back to 2013, the numbers generally started for de novos around like the mid 40s, I guess. And now we're definitely like trailing up into like the high 60s. So definitely seeing an uptick even in the numbers FDA is receiving.
I think we're seeing that as well in the number that we're helping submit right now at RQM Plus. So there's been a huge increase with the number of companies that are coming to us saying, please help us with our de novo, or can you review this before we send it in? And also it's, one of the things that we've been really trying to do is make sure that these companies do their due diligence to make sure that they still are a de novo. I think we've been seeing so many come through FDA that it's always good to do that sanity check and make sure that there's not another company that might have opened a new regulation for you and that there might be a 510K pathway instead for you. So really getting FDA's insight into that and their opinion before you actually send that de novo over to FDA and have them do your eligibility review for you.
Are there any advantages to going the de novo route over the 510K?
I've seen some, and part of that is trying to do the first 510K after a de novo. FDA really establishes those special controls in that de novo process. And if you're really good and you add some really good, tight special controls, it makes it a lot harder for people to follow and really to match you. And even though the 510K process is open to them, we are seeing FDA hold pretty tight to some of those specifications that come through on the first submission. You don't have that long history where you can spread things out like you can later.
Yeah, Sorry, yeah, I was just going to say, even on top of the special controls, like Nancy said, that's kind of your chance to have your say in how the future devices will be classified and reviewed. But on top of that, too, if a company is really if they're confident in their bench testing or their clinical data, I think that gives you a chance to kind of set the bar for whatever, clinical evidence or other data expectations, any competitors coming afterwards might have as well. So it's really your kind of chance to shape what that landscape for that device area will look like.
And process-wise, I was going to say, is FDA's gotten more familiarity with the de novo process. I know when I left, for example, when I was in the ortho group, we didn't have that many de novos. So when we saw one, it was a really big deal for the organization. How do we deal with this? How do we push this through the process? How do we review it, right? Timelines, memos, all of that. But FDA is now putting out the E-Star for de novos. They're seeing more of this. They're becoming more comfortable with this. So the process of getting with de novos in the future should be more smooth than it was, say, even like 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more guidance and, guidance documents from FDA, and it's not just useful for industry, right? Those aren't just for us to review. That's why on the cover page of those, it says it's for industry and FDA staff. And I think that's really helpful for a lot of the reviewers who, maybe handed a de novo, they are given some training on how to review those, but it's nice for them also to have the guidance documents sitting in front of them so they know what's expected of them as they go through their review process.
We have an audience question related to this. What time frame might be expected to get a meeting for an IVD de novo pre-sub? Has anybody gone for one of those?
I see it says Nancy. So Nancy, do you want to take the first stab? But I have some insight into this too.
Yeah, I think, right, as we know, IVDs have been really tough to get pre-subs for the last 2 years, and rightfully so. COVID is driving it. You can get them. Sometimes it takes some persistence. We have seen some where you get the meeting within the time frame, like in your normal 75 to 90 days time frame, and then FDA pushes it back at the end. So you might have to wait another week or two or a month to actually have your call. We've also seen where persistence pays off. You submit the first request, it doesn't get granted, you submit it again. And then sometimes they relent and say, okay, this person's not going away, or maybe we framed up the questions a little bit differently and you get that. Certainly, if you think you're de novo, a pre-sub is definitely a way to go. You're going to want to have that interaction and have that conversation. So I think framing it that way so that your pre-sub, it makes it very clear that you expect to be a de novo, helps in that regard. And Allison, I don't know, I know you've had some experience as well in the space.
Yeah. I mean, because last year, certain offices at FDA were canceling pre-submissions. Some of the news that came out from Dr. Shuren and Dr. Mizell earlier this year, which was really exciting to hear, is that those groups, especially the IVD reviewers, were going to be opening up the pre-sub process, getting through a lot of the backlog of many of their files, and also really focusing on the companies that had an IVD that was likely going to be a de novo or a PMA, and prioritizing the review for those. So I think you're in, for the person who asked that question, I think you're actually in a good position to maybe try and send that in and make sure to weave that argument into the cover letter so that they prioritize your file as it comes in.
Yeah, and as a quick plug, we did just release an analysis white paper on RQM's website regarding MDUFA numbers for 2021, and we do go into detail about kind of like trends we're seeing with Q sub numbers, meeting scheduling dates, as well as just potential delays to expect in 2022. So I think, I guess even as FDA goes moving into 2022, and Dr. Shuren had that post about opening up files, I think still expect some delays probably across the board.
Did you write that, Kevin, that white paper?
Ryan and I both did.
Oh no, it was so good. I decided to do the authors. Amazing job.
Another audience question. How do you know if there's already a de novo approval with the FDA?
Yeah, so as far as the de novo approvals, or the granting of them, I suppose FDA does have the de novo database. So I mean, that's always a good place to start. You can, if you know generally like what keywords to look for, and if there's a certain, if your device has a certain easy to find description, I suppose you can search in there for that. And other than that, I mean, they post when new ones are granted, so you can go through and see, some of the more recent de novo approvals.
That is part of the de novo submission, is identifying how you conducted your search. So hopefully, as you're filling out the de novo process, even if you didn't find initially, going through that process of identifying, like, explain to FDA why you don't think there's a predicate. Hopefully, that if there was one existing, then you'd find it during that submission stage.
Yeah. The other place I like to go look is clinicaltrials.gov, because you'll see clinical trials, and then you can see sponsor names or device names, and then go search for de novo by that name, because it's sometimes clunky to search the de novo database. It's not the cleanest search functionality, at least in my estimation. You really have to open documents and look. So knowing there might be something out there is helpful, and helps you with the search terms as well, to know what they were calling the device and how they were testing it. Also can alert you that maybe there's something in process, and then I go look for that company's website and see where they are and what they're posting to their, in their press releases, because sometimes they'll say, oh, we just filed our application. And it's great to know that that's in process.
Yeah, I think
marketing.
sometimes it will take a little bit of time to release that decision summary, because FDA releases the classification order right away. But we've been waiting on we have some that we've been waiting on for years to see what the decision summary is and what sort of testing was included in that de novo. So that can be a real market advantage as well for those companies, that they are the only ones who know what actually it took to get through. Anyway, interesting strategy.
Our next question, are you seeing more requests for clinical data with 510Ks? Has that changed?
Yes. Yeah, I think historically in our 510Ks, we always said about 10% of the 510Ks we sent in needed some sort of real world evidence or something, if they had OUS experience with the device. And I've been telling clients recently, we're probably up to about 20%. And maybe it's the uniqueness with a lot of the devices that we work with, because my team at Acknowledge and now with, bringing over to RQM Plus, really working with smaller startups. So I do think for novel technology, especially in the 510K space, FDA said you need to have some clinical to share with us.
Yeah, I definitely think for your types of devices, after getting some insight, it definitely seems like the it's very specific to yours, as in, they create new product codes for you or inside regulations. And I feel like those types of 510Ks where it's like not necessarily de novo, but just kind of carving out a new space in existing regulation would definitely require a 510K. We're definitely require clinical.
Yeah, I agree.
The other thing I notice is we're seeing it more if you shift the specifications for a device just a little bit one way or another, where maybe in the past you could have justified that away. They really want to see the data. If you want to expand that spec range, they want to understand what data is behind that and know that it's good quality clinical data to support that expansion.
100%. I agree.
Yeah, I've been seeing more requests for clinical data with, I think, breakthrough device requests. Because on the one hand, some of the early devices in the breakthrough program, those submissions may be going back 5-6 years now at this point. So there's a little more understanding of, how exactly, safe and effective those kinds of devices will be. But I think also with, new breakthrough device requests, there may be more requests for initial clinical data to demonstrate, that your device might be more effective. I think the breakthrough device guidance, it says that clinical data is not required, but I think there have been more requests for some initial clinical data just to say, there's a reasonable expectation that this thing will be more effective than other devices out there.
Okay, another audience question. What about for processes like sterilization for novel approaches? Do they also have de novo status?
I've not seen it for a sterilization. You may require more bench testing to say that sterilization method didn't impact the device, but typically that can be addressed in bench testing. I haven't seen that require a de novo.
I haven't either. Whether it raises different questions of safety and effectiveness. I have seen new sterilization methods make it successfully through FDA, and it's usually through the 510K review process.
Okay. What is another trend that you're seeing that we haven't talked about yet?
Biocompatibility has been kind of interesting lately, getting a lot more feedback. And one situation which I thought was really odd was we had a variety, it was a system, so there were a variety of sizes and different interactions. And FDA agreed that we had identified the worst case in terms of maximum material exposure, but they wanted the other extreme tested as well. So we had to go back and do testing on best case and worst case, which was really odd. And when we talked to the lab, they said, oh yeah, they're seeing that more and more often, where FDA wants you to bracket and do biocompatibility testing on the whole bracket rather than what you consider the worst case.
I had a string of biocompatibility, I don't know how to say issues, but comments from FDA, questions from FDA recently. I know there's been a big push for companies and FDA adopting chemical characterization testing and extractable leachables, but it seems like there's a new set of boilerplate deficiencies that are going out, and it's this kind of big list of questions now received on multiple pre-subs that come in, and it's like a list of like 27 deficiencies that are pretty long and pretty in-depth for what they want for chemical characterization information. The other one that I've heard FDA that I ran into recently was that FDA's been trying to say they've been wanting to reduce animal testing. And something that I saw was that ISO 10993-23 for irritation testing was recognized, But I guess in speaking to some colleagues, it seems like it's only made. So let me just backtrack. The -23 is for in vitro testing instead of the normal in vivo testing. I know the FDA has a push to try to reduce animal testing for biocom. And it seems like even though the -23 is recognized on FDA's website for in vitro to reduce animal testing, it's only partially recognized. So hopefully in this new year, FDA starts moving towards more adopting this fully -23 to reduce the need for animal testing for irritation.
Yeah, I think that's one of the differences I see between the EU and US is EU moved to that chemical characterization a little bit quicker and is more likely to allow that justification that if you've got that, you might not have to do all the testing. I really, even though FDA may be asking for it more, I really haven't seen them use it to accept not doing more testing. So they're still kind of going to that traditional guidance, box in the back that says, if you're this kind of device with this exposure, you need these tests.
The only difference I've seen though is for intact skin. So I know Nancy, you and I have talked a lot about that draft guidance document in past, but I have seen quite a few reviewers and FDA upper management say this is, while it's in its draft format, we are honoring this as our current thinking. And it does help to reduce the amount of testing. So if it's a device that only touches intact skin, and even if it's permanent contact duration, you can really reduce the amount of testing that you have to do if it's made out of specific materials and if you have an appropriate justification. So we've had a lot of success with that recently.
Have an audience question. For breakthrough submissions, you mentioned clinical data. Does FDA accept testing on retrospectively collected biobanked clinical samples, or are they looking for prospectively collected clinical trials?
I think they're asking specifically for breakthrough. With that, everyone agree with that?
Yeah.
So for breakthrough submissions, yes, I think you pull from whatever you can to try and provide clinical evidence. I think the phrase that always comes up, especially when we have conversations with FDA, when we're within the breakthrough review process, is reasonable expectation. And I think FDA's definition of reasonable and industry's expectation of reasonable sometimes is not, does not see eye to eye, but it's really trying to get whatever, whether it's animal data, historic information that you have in literature, or testing on your device, even if it's banked samples, I would say all of that can be very helpful as FDA makes their decision for your breakthrough device.
Also, I know you had a large proportion of step designations for which is relatively new and amazing. Would you say that for step designations, you'd also need the same amount of clinical as you would for a breakthrough?
I think, well, yes, that's what I've seen. So every step file that we've submitted, it did include clinical. I think FDA has reviewed so many breakthrough submissions that now that they're reviewing safer technology entrance or program entrance requests, that's such a mouthful, they are relying heavily on their experience with the breakthrough as they review those submissions. So I think, when breakthrough first came out, I don't know if you guys had the same experience, but they were much easier to get through and no clinical data, this is reasonable expectation. Where now it's gotten harder, and I'd say rightfully so. And I think Safer Technologies program sort of jumped that honeymoon period, and we're right in the smack dab clinical section of it.
Okay, next trend. What else have you seen? Anything with submissions
So last year they released the MR guidance document. And I think it especially affects implantable ortho devices. It changed, I guess, how you would approach simulations, how you do your labeling, patient implant cards, and we're seeing a lot of deficiencies as FDA is now rolling out this guide, not rolling out, but now fully implementing this guidance. I know in the very beginning there was a little question of oh, how are you supposed to do it in patient implant cards, or how should you update your labeling? And now it seems like FDA's gotten more finger on their pulse, how to do this, and we're receiving more questions on our simulation data or our labeling for MR, and I think that will continue, especially for implantable devices.
It was kind of odd the way the implant card it was just a little line item in the middle of a guidance, and then it got released with no fanfare. I think a lot of people just missed that nuance and that detail and that guidance.
Any trend with eStars?
Yeah, I think eStar, it's becoming adopted. They're getting more experience with it and starting to be used. I still think once eStar gets up and running more and people are more familiar with it, I think it can help with the amount of time it takes for some of FDA's reviews. I know when I was an FDA reviewer, I think one of the more frustrating things or more inefficient things was about a review of a file was just trying to find documents. A lot of times documents might be named really strange things, but if the eStar submissions are kind of matching up different documents or different types of testing with the kind of review format that reviewers are expecting or are used to, it'll really help save a lot of time in that sense. So I think it can help with efficiency, and it's definitely getting used more and should become more fine-tuned as FDA gets experience with it.
Yeah, I find it useful even if I'm not using the template, but maybe I'm doing a PMA, I pull up those sections of the eStar and walk through all the questions that they ask. And then when I write my submission, I might add a table with those questions and answers, just trying to make it easier for the reviewer to fill in their checklist so they have all the information they need. And sometimes it's just a matter of, oh, I didn't think to add this line item, but it's obvious if you knew the device. And so making that easy for the reviewer to find, it never a bad thing in my mind. I always want a happy reviewer.
So when will it be required?
So word on the street that it's going to be required a bit earlier than any of us think. I think we've all just been, it's a voluntary program and submit it if you like, and you won't get refused. The file won't go through the RTA process. You're automatically accepted, which is a huge benefit, I think, for folks who really want to make sure that they stay on the review clock up until, at least a substantive interaction. So I do think it's coming. I mean, they have ones for all the different types of submissions now. And it's hugely helpful. I agree with Nancy. Like I was doing another one last night, and one of the things that I love about it is you put in the product code and it'll spit out all the device specific guidance documents that are relevant to you. And if there's anything that you've missed, it finds it for you. So it's a really impressive document. I just wish sometimes you push a button and it takes a really long time to click. Like thinks for 5 seconds and then it uploads.
That's good. A couple software as a medical device questions. I'm surprised we made it 20 minutes without these. They're always popular. What about software as a medical device? Can it be a breakthrough or de novo based on the indication or results it produces?
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There already are examples.
Yeah, and I think you'll see more of it even. Like the way I was actually talking to Allison right before this, and it seems like that group in FDA is really creating specific buckets for these de novos, which just makes it a little bit hard to, if you have a similar type of device, to come in and use an existing regulation if they're making it so specific. So you might even see more de novos in this space, depending on indications or device characteristics.
Yeah, I'd recommend too, if you go in for a pre-submission or if you have a breakthrough designation and you go in for a sprint and want to talk about your software-based device, ask for someone from the Digital Health Center of Excellence. I can't remember. I think that's the full name. But you can ask and request that one of them be in the meeting. And that's been extremely valuable because they sort of sit across different offices. And so they see all the different types of files that are coming in, either with SAMD or some sort of digital therapeutic, digital diagnostic that is, it's really helpful to have their insight and oversight of all the different centers or offices.
Next audience question, is the FDA moving to provide better guidance on expectations for software as a medical device products, especially IVD products? Security is a concern as to what is good enough.
I think they are. I think on their, late last year, they published their list of guidances or their guidance priorities for 2022. And they had several different guidance priorities. One is for software as a medical device. They definitely plan to issue a draft guidance. It's on their A list for the year. They had a few others about cybersecurity and similar things. So I definitely think it's on their radar. And I think they plan to issue some kind of guidance. I'm not sure about IVD specifically, but it does seem like it's something on their A-list, they call it.
Next question. What is the trend right now with emergency use authorizations? Can you still submit them, or should you just go for a 510K?
I would be very careful submitting one right now, and I would only do it if I met the priority criteria. So, for example, if you're doing a COVID antigen test, FDA really wants one that's home use and has the ability to scale up to a really large number really fast. So if you're a small manufacturer, you're not going to get a priority review under FDA, under the EUA, and you're probably quicker going a traditional submission route where you're bound by those MDUFA goals. If you have something that's truly an immediate public health need, absolutely, the EUA is a great program, and follow it and use the templates, and it would be a great tool. But make sure you have a device that truly fits what FDA is prioritizing right now.
If you look at those guidances, like Ryan mentioned as well, you'll see that they have 2 EUA transition guidance documents already, and they're published in draft. And it kind of outlines FDA's thinking of how they view the transition and what different steps and where you should be in the process as they transition away from EUAs to 510Ks or normal marketing submissions. So if people haven't looked at that yet and you have an EUA, I think it's something to consider moving into this year.
Okay. I have time for one more audience question. Do we think that the FDA will feel a need to adjust anything if CMS finally goes through with MCIT 2.0 and grants payments for breakthrough devices approved based on safety and efficacy and breakthrough status, but not cost considerations?
I don't think they're going to change anything about the program. I think it would be really challenging to actually do something that's statutory that goes, as part of that guidance and regulation. But I do think no matter what, I think it will impact FDA reviewers' opinions about breakthroughs. I think they're so overwhelmed with a lot of submissions anyway, and breakthrough submissions take a lot of time and resources. So it may, I don't know, it may change their opinion about some of the breakthrough submissions that they're looking at. I'd love to know other comments on that too from the panelists.
I mean, if it goes through, I feel like that would make breakthrough even more desirable.
No, right?
Breakthrough requests would just shoot out.
It's been a big driver of them for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and the more desirable, the more applications, the more picky you can be about which ones you accept.
Yeah, more clinical data.
Yep.
We won't have time to answer it, but there was a question in the comments, not Q&A, about eStar templates. I'll nominate Ryan, our eStar expert. Maybe you could just give them the link, send them to the right place.
Yeah.
Also in the comments, just to wrap it up, we placed a link to our Knowledge Center, which has so much content like the white papers we talked about, and our live show that is very much like this every other week, panel of experts talking about hot topics and providing solutions to the audience. And we also have that in a podcast format. So check out that link. You can find all of that for download. So thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Lisa, Nancy, Allison, Ryan, Kevin. You guys are awesome. I highly recommend you all do check out that podcast. I always am amazed how much information the group of you can get out in 30 minutes or less. I remember the first time we were planning this, it's like, you have 7 speakers. I don't know, that seems like a lot for 30 minutes. And you guys are just awesome about pumping through some great information. So thank you for putting this together. Really appreciate having you. Okay, so we are going to transition to our next session, which is all about FDA enforcement trends and regulatory priorities with Covington. So Pam and Kristen, I am going to turn things over to you if you all are ready. I am absolutely thrilled to have you joining us and telling us what the FDA is doing from an enforcement perspective.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And if it's okay, we're going to share a presentation.
Sounds great.
Kristen, are you able to bring it up? Hold on.
While you guys are setting that up, I will just let everybody know, in case you've just joined us in the last hour, we will be recording this entire program. So you will have a link sent to you after the program ends with the 3-hour program combined into one video. So you'll be able to review everything that has gone on today. Additionally, we do have programmed for another 2 hours. So we've got 2 more sessions right now. And then our closing keynote with Dr. Jeff Shuren will kick off at 11 a.m. So just give you guys a little bit of an update on that. Also, Q&A is going very well. I do recommend if you have Q&A though, please use the Q&A button, not the chat. Sometimes speakers do not see the chat. So I would, and it's hard to export that afterwards in case your questions don't get answered live because we run out of time. So please use Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Okay, looks like you all are set. Kristen and Pamela, I will turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. And good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. As Rachel said, we're going to take a look at sort of the way that enforcement trends are heading in the medical device industry. And we're also going to focus on what is a really important priority in the next year for FDA. And the speaker from the last panel kind of nicely teed it up for us, which is the transition away from the policies and processes that FDA and industry relied on during the pandemic, the EUAs and the enforcement discretion policies. So we'll take a bit of a deep dive into the way that FDA proposes to transition away from those. So I think we can move to the next slide. So we'll start with a discussion on device enforcement trends. We can go to the next slide, Kristen. And we're actually, I think, at a really important and interesting juncture. I like to start with this slide, which is very vivid and shows a precipitous drop in both overall device warning letters over the last several years, which is that top line. And then the blue bars are the quality system warning letters. And it's nearly a straight line drop. There's a bit of an uptick in 2021, which relates to the COVID healthcare fraud warning letters. But overall, the trend line is just down, down, down. A stark picture. And I think, begs the question, what's going on? What's driving this steep decline? And do we expect it to continue? So if you move to the next slide, I think that there's really a constellation of factors that over the last several years have accounted for this downward trend particularly in quality system warning letters. And I think the most significant contributor is the Medical Device Single Audit Program, MDSAP, which of course is the program that allows companies to opt in favor of a third-party audit, which then replaces FDA's routine audits. Doesn't replace FDA's directed or for-cause audits or pre-approval audits, but does replace FDA's routine audits. And so, the bottom line is that FDA has spent much less time inspecting facilities over the last handful of years due to MDSAP. And of course, it's those facility inspections that are almost always the trigger for the quality system warning letter that may ultimately issue. So I rate that as number one in terms of contributor to this decline. And I think, everyone would probably agree that MDSAP is here to stay for at least some number of years. But what else is going on? I don't think it's just MDSAP. Well, in terms of the political environment, I think until recently, we were in a rather anti-enforcement political environment, which I think did not solely cause, but sort of complemented and contributed to what was already a downward trend in the warning letters. And we'll talk in a moment about the fact that I think we may be seeing a bit of an uptick as a result of the change in political environment in Washington. There's also been, over the last really several years, CDRH has been more focused on collaboration with industry as a mechanism to achieve better device quality as opposed to sort of traditional straight line enforcement. We saw several years ago FDA sort of coming up with a case for quality. Again, the core principles being working together with industry, quality can be achieved in a fuller way than sort of a severe quality system crackdown. So I think that's a theme that's been with us for several years and has continued. And then, of course, in the right-hand corner, the elephant in the room is the pandemic. And, you know, inspections really stopped, except for the most emergent ones during the inspection and during the pandemic. And they're on hold again for a bit because of Omicron. And so, you know, that in combination with MDSAP really ground inspections nearly to a halt. And so I think all of those things together have created this, this picture that we saw in the previous slide, which is this steep decline in quality system warning letters. And I think we can move to the next slide, Kristen.
And I'm trying, for some reason it's not working.
Well, I'll preview the next slide, which is really just a visual, and we'll show you, there we go.
No, there we go.
So this just shows again vividly the drop in inspections. This is total inspections, domestic and foreign. And look at those low numbers in 2021 and 2022. That's pandemic plus MDSAP, I think. But that, I think, in many ways explains that first bar chart, which showed just that drop in quality system warning letters. So we can move to the next slide, Kristen. So, here we sit at the bottom of that chart, and of course, it screams the question: what do we think is going to happen now? And I think as we look at things, it appears to us that the new administration seems to be more focused on traditional enforcement than the previous administration. We saw in the summer, when we thought we were putting the pandemic in a rearview mirror, inspections picked up in the summer, and there was actually a spate of quality system warning letters in early fiscal year 2022. Interestingly, so far in fiscal year 2022, we've had 8 quality system warning letters, and in all of 2021, we only had 5. So I think, is it a mini trend? Is it a blip? It's a bit early to know, but my sense is that we're on the cusp of a bit of a different direction. So what is really happening? I mean, as we know, MDSAP it replaces those routine inspections. So it's not really more routine inspections. I think anecdotally, what we see is more directed or for-cause inspections. It appears to us that FDA is looking for ways to get back into the facilities, and the vehicle in is that it appears to be the directed inspection, just from where we sit. And where is FDA focusing its enforcement? I say it's the usual suspects: MDR reporting, complaint investigations, risk assessment, design controls. Nothing new there. Interestingly, I mentioned that in fiscal year 2022, so far, we've had 8 quality system warning letters, and 7 of those have had MDR reporting citations. So again, a bit early to know what this all means, but it does appear to be a slightly different color than we've seen over the last several years. Looks like we're on the cusp of a bit of a turn. I think we can move to the next one, Kristen. Well, of course, it's not just quality system warning letters that industry focuses on, but what's happening on the advertising and promotion side. And it's kind of the same picture. The warning letters have been down, and you can see those zeros in 2021 and 2022. This is the chart of warning letters around off-label promotion and comparative claims, kind of those traditional promotional violations. So again, downward trend in those warning letters. We can move to the next slide. What explains that trend. I think, several years ago in the 2014-15 period, there were a number of challenges that were brought against FDA on a First Amendment basis, challenging FDA's longstanding prohibition against off-label promotion. And those challenges prevailed in many cases. And our sense is that that has been a driver of the decline in promotion-related warning letters, that it had a chilling effect on FDA's sort of eagerness to be out front with traditional enforcement on promotion-related issues. I will say, though, that all the way along, even during those down years on the chart with promotional warning letters, we in the FDA bar have continued to see FDA engage with industry on promotional issues in a more informal way through email inquiries. During the course of a 510K review, for example, FDA raising questions about current claims on the website. Sort of a more behind the scenes informal approach, but nonetheless, I think FDA manifesting that it still continues to have a real interest in promotion, albeit still a hesitation to issue those formal warning letters. And again, I think in the promotional area, we may be at a crossroads, and looking at if not a reversal, perhaps a turn in enforcement trends. A couple of things to note. I think a few recent developments reflect FDA perhaps reasserting its traditional views on off-label promotion. As I said, there were a handful of cases that challenged FDA where industry won on the off-label promotion issue. But we do see, I think, a bit of a reassertion of FDA's traditional views. And if we move to the next slide, I can give a little bit of color on that. So there's a recent case, United States v. Facto, which I won't go into in any detail, but it is a bit of a turn from the series of losses that FDA has had on the First Amendment point. And in this case, the district court upheld misdemeanor charges against executives at a device company on the grounds that misbranded and adulterated devices were distributed due to off-label promotion. So that's worth a look. It's kind of a turn from what we had seen for many years in terms of FDA's success on the First Amendment issue. And then another, I think, important milestone, in last summer, we saw the issuance of the final rule on intended use. And again, I think FDA's traditional views on intended use prevailed in this final regulation. Here, the final regulation kind of ended where it started, which is that intended use can be derived not just from statements and claims on the labeling, but the manufacturer's knowledge of how the device is being used can be a contributor, not the sole basis, but a contributor to how intended use is determined. So I think, again, these are subtle signs, but I think important ones to pay attention to in terms of where things are heading in terms of enforcement in the promotional landscape. I think we can go to the next slide, Kristen. And then I think the final point I'd like to make in terms of, where are we going on enforcement is just to observe that this is not new today or yesterday, but I think over the last several years, we've seen some changes in how CDRH interacts with industry. On the one hand, we've seen the reorganization of CDRH with the sort of total life cycle approach to devices. How has that manifested itself in terms of, and I'll put enforcement in air quotes, but FDA expressing its concerns to industry? Well, now that the Office of Compliance itself doesn't exist and pre-market folks are involved in post-market issues, what we're seeing is across the life cycle of the device, FDA, I think, making deeper inquiries into technical issues like risk assessments. We see traditional post-market concerns like MDR reporting being raised during the pre-market reviews. Now, this is not, of course, enforcement in terms of warning letters, but I think these are sort of newer ways for FDA to express its concerns to industry over the life cycle of the device. As I mentioned in the promotional context, we see FDA acting more informally with industry. While the warning letters are down, I think the email correspondence is up. And in many ways, those communications hold the same message, where FDA has found perhaps a promotional approach that it feels is inconsistent with FDA requirements. So, again, we have seen FDA continue to be engaged in what we think of as non-traditional enforcement. The warning letters are down, but I think FDA interaction and engagement is sort of as vigorous as ever. And then the final point I would make in terms of kind of characterizing this non-traditional enforcement landscape is I think we've seen, and I haven't done the math on it, but we certainly seem to be seeing an issuance of a number of safety communications. Those communications where FDA expresses its concern to industry about a particular type of device, a particular pattern of adverse events. And again, that's a tool for FDA to get the word out. It certainly has impact on a company who operates in that industry sector in terms of scrutiny and product liability interest. So I think across the board, the nature of the enforcement landscape has changed from a sort of many years ago, pure traditional issuance of warning letters to this whole constellation of approaches that may encompass both an uptick in traditional warning letters, but really a sort of comprehensive utilization of a basket of non-traditional approaches to enforcement. So with that, I want to turn it to Kristen to talk about a significant regulatory priority, which is FDA's proposed transition process out of the pandemic policies. Kristen?
Thank you, Pam. As was nicely teed up by the previous presenters, I am going to talk a little bit about the draft guidances that CDRH recently issued to describe the proposed transition process and what the regulatory landscape will look like after the pandemic. Even though it appears right now that we're still very much in the middle of the pandemic, CDRH has given a lot of thought to what the transition process should look like. And the interesting and probably very unique part of this pandemic is that there were a lot of devices that have use outside of the pandemic. So it wasn't the types of devices that were distributed during the pandemic weren't just COVID-19 tests that really have no use once COVID is no longer around or once the pandemic is gone, but devices such as ventilators, patient monitoring systems that were distributed during the pandemic, but could be used for a number of uses that have nothing to do with COVID. So the question really is what to do with these devices that were distributed under an EUA or an enforcement policy and can continue to be used post-pandemic. Now, as the devices during the pandemic were distributed either under an EUA or an enforcement policy. And an EUA was the emergency use authorization, which in many cases required a submission to FDA. The enforcement policies were essentially guidance documents that outlined certain conditions and requirements for specific devices. And if those were met, those devices could be distributed in the US without meeting certain regulatory requirements that would otherwise be applicable. So for example, many of the EUAs waived GMP requirements such that the devices could be manufactured without the quality controls that are typically in place. There were also other accommodations, I would say, that enforcement policies, for example, made, such that changes could be made without submitting a 510K, where a 510K would have otherwise been required. Now, when the emergency ends, traditional marketing authorizations will once again be required because there's no emergency period and authority for FDA to issue EUAs. And FDA at the same time will enforce all traditional and regulatory requirements that are otherwise in place. So these draft guidances describe FDA's approach to how to transition to the post-pandemic state, where once again traditional requirements, laws, and regulations apply. In both cases, EUAs and enforcement policies, FDA will allow for a transition period. It's a 100-day transition period that, depending on EUA or enforcement policy, has a different start time and different criterion as to when the 100-day transition period is going to start. But the important thing is there will be time to prepare for the transition. Under the enforcement policy, FDA's draft guidance also outlines, under devices distributed under the enforcement policy, FDA also outlines 3 phases where essentially certain regulatory requirements are complied with at certain timeframes up to the 180 days where full compliance is required. Now, manufacturers are encouraged to submit notifications of intent for certain reusable life-supporting or life-sustaining devices, such as oxygen generators and ventilators. And here, the draft guidance requests or recommends that within 90 days of the start of the transition period, these manufacturers submit information regarding whether or not they intend to submit a marketing submission to continue distributing after the transition period. And I think in large part, this relates to CDRH's ability to plan for what types of submissions, how many submissions will be submitted, and who is planning on keeping their EUA or enforcement discretion distributed products on the market after the transition period. The draft guidance also provides for enforcement discretion for certain devices, assuming that certain conditions are met. So the draft guidance proposes enforcement discretion if for devices that don't have a marketing authorization, such as a 510K or PMA, if a marketing submission has been submitted and accepted by FDA before the end of the transition period, and FDA has not taken final action on the submission. So during this time frame, FDA has proposed to exercise enforcement discretion. The marketing submission, FDA recommends that the marketing submission also include a transition plan that describes the manufacturer's plan, what to do in the event of a positive or a negative decision on the marketing submission. In any event, this implementation plan should include the plan to notify stakeholders of the change in the device's regulatory status. Now, as I mentioned previously, following the pandemic, the statutory and regulatory requirements will apply just like they always have. So there are no special conditions anymore, like there were during the EUA or enforcement policy period. Now, manufacturers must discontinue distribution of their devices if by the end of the transition period, the marketing submission has not been accepted by FDA, or when a manufacturer receives a negative decision on the marketing submission, withdraws the submission, or fails to timely respond to the additional information request. So that's when the enforcement discretion period under the proposed guidance would end. Now, if a manufacturer does not intend to distribute devices after the transition period, FDA has proposed that previously distributed devices can remain on the market if certain conditions are met. And so these devices are single-use, non-life supporting or non-life sustaining devices. So this is, for example, masks. So essentially the masks that have been distributed could stay on the market and would just be used up. For reusable, non-life supporting, non-life sustaining devices, for example, patient monitoring devices, and for reusable life supporting and life sustaining devices, such as ventilators, these can stay on the market if they are restored to their previously cleared or approved version, or have publicly available labeling that describes the features and the regulatory status, and in the case of life supporting and life sustaining, also a physical copy of the labeling that describes the features and the regulatory status. So if those conditions are met, those can stay on the market. For EUA authorized IVDs, and this applies only to EUA IVDs, they can be used for 2 years after the EUA determination date or until the expiration date, whichever is less. Now, FDA is accepting comments on the draft guidances until March 23, 2022. And there are a number of potential areas for comments. So for example, the transition period, which is 180 days, whether or not that's sufficient time, whether or not another potential area for comment is whether or not the draft guidance satisfies the requirement in the law for FDA to consult with the manufacturer of an EUA authorized product on the appropriate disposition of the product. So instead of consulting with each manufacturer, FDA has proposed to use the guidance to satisfy this requirement. And then there's another potential area that FDA has flagged for comment, which relates to the list of guidance documents that are in the list of enforcement policies identified in a draft guidance, and whether or not there should be any guidance documents added or removed from the list. So there's a number of interesting concepts and proposed approaches, which I believe are very thoughtful and really address a lot of the questions that industry has had over the last few months on what the transition period would look like. But as we think about this transition period, if there are certainly still questions remaining and questions based on this draft guidance that FDA will accept comments on, and there may be an opportunity to provide guidance and really input as FDA shapes these transition processes. And this concludes our presentation, so we can take questions if we have time left. Well, we have 1 minute.
Yeah, I think we have 1 minute left. I will read off one of the questions that came in from the chat, since we just have 1 minute. Pamela, are FDA trends, or is FDA trending toward remote or virtual inspections?
You know, on the device side, we really haven't seen the virtual inspections. So I would say from where I sit on devices, I think it's in person. I don't know, Kristen, if you've seen anything different.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah. And I don't know why exactly, but that's what we've seen.
Great. There is one more question. I don't know if we have time for it, so maybe Pam, you could take a look at it in the Q&A button and maybe just type a response for Narendra. He's asking about third-party entity recognition when it comes to MDSAP. So if you would maybe take a look at that one, that would be great.
Sure.
Pam, Kristen, thank you so much for that. That was wonderful, and we are absolutely thrilled to have had you. So thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay, so I see Sean Burke teed up and ready to go. So I'm gonna not take too much time switching over to him, but Sean, thank you so much for representing Duane Morris and talking to us about considerations around product liability and additive manufacturing. I know this is something you and I have chatted about quite a bit because I find it very interesting from a 3D printing perspective and point of care. So I would love to hear what you have to say about that. So the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Rachel. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Sean Burke. I'm an attorney at the law firm of Duane Morris. out of our Washington, D.C. office, where I focus my practice on advising and defending medical device clients against the threat and risks of products liability. Just for the record, although I am in Washington, D.C., for the benefit of this group, I am born and raised in New England, from Vermont originally, and as a medical device attorney with roots in New England, I always appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group, and thank you so much, Rachel, for the invitation to talk with you all today about this concept of regulation of additive manufacturing and how it raises a lot of uncertainties and issues and how those play into my area, which is products liability. So as a products liability attorney, one of my main goals is to advise medical device companies against the threat of the unknown. And while predicting the unknown may sound daunting, there are certain basic legal tenets and concepts that have formed the backbone of products liability law for decades. And these tenets allow companies to at least have some understanding, some prediction, some certainty on how their company, their products will be judged by a judge, by a jury, and by the law. And that does allow for a fair assessment of risk before jumping into something. Innovation, however, in general, challenges this framework. And one of those innovations that I think poses the greatest stretch to these basic tenets is this concept of 3D printing additive manufacturing, especially in the point of care context, where the printing can occur on site to address patient-specific needs. A great benefit of this technology, but also raises a lot of questions, very basic questions that were never doubted or looked at under traditional manufacturing in the products liability law context, such as who's the manufacturer and what is the product, are uncertain when it comes to 3D printing. And again, especially in that point of care context. So simply put, additive manufacturing is one of those innovations that's outpacing the regulations, it's outpacing the law, it's outpacing the consensus standards. And that creates some risks. I know this is obviously an FDA panel and presentation, so I'll focus a lot of my points on FDA sort of oversight and the input it's had to date on 3D printing. And I know a lot of you all on this call view the FDA as a necessary hurdle to get your product to the market. As a defense attorney, though, I see it as a lot more. I see the FDA compliance and regulatory clearance as a shield. It's some of the best evidence that you can put forth at a trial to show that your company acted reasonably, you complied with the state of the art, it's an assurance of safety and efficacy. There's a lot that you can do with that clearance and with that compliance that helps a company faced with products liability exposure. Some of that is missing when it comes to 3D printing because we don't have that well-established FDA guidance. We don't have well-established FDA regulations. I'll talk a little bit about some of the pieces that the FDA has put out on additive manufacturing. Their leapfrog draft guidance in 2017, the very recent statements on point of care from just this past December. But what those documents really do is they identify some concerns, they identify the risks with 3D printing, but they don't necessarily say how you're supposed to address them or what the guidance is or what the standards are. And that creates an unenviable position for medical device manufacturers interested in 3D printing. Because here you have the FDA saying, well, you know what, the use of recycled materials, that's a problem. You should do something about that, but not necessarily setting forth what that guidance looks like, the policies for how much recycled material can be used from print to print. And that's a difficult position to be in when a problem's been identified, but the solutions are sort of unclear. It leaves device companies out there winging it. I'll talk a little about ASTM standards. F42 has been great. They have over 10 years of standards, but it's not the same type of certainty, not the same type of framework that we're used to. And so that uncertainty creates some risks. And that's really the framework for my conversation today. I want to talk about the FDA oversight and the comments to date, do a very brief products liability 101, just to kind of frame our conversation so you can see how unique 3D printing is and how it raises some challenges. And then talk a little bit about some of the issues raised, some of the challenges, propose a couple scenarios for the group to consider and just to see some of the things you need to think about and some best practices you can employ when looking at these regulations, looking at the draft guidance and protecting your company against these potential unknowns. Before I jump into that though, one caveat that I always have to give, as a products liability attorney, I stand up here at these presentations and often give a parade of horribles, everything that can go wrong. And sometimes that's seen as deterring an innovation or a certain from a company from taking certain actions. That's certainly not my intent when it comes to 3D printing. I think we all saw firsthand at the start of the pandemic, the power of 3D printing and how it helped address the PPE shortage early on. Working with clients and with experts at some of the amazing things that this technology is able to do. Patient matching, the customized products, the bioprinting that they're doing with tissues and organs is just unbelievable and really a very bright and exciting future for this technology. And by no means am I trying to suggest that it should be harnessed or deterred. Really, all I'm trying to do is identify the risks, because I think that's important for a company for two reasons. One, when you identify the risks, you can weigh them against the benefits and make an informed decision about whether this is something your company has the stomach for going forward. And two, also by identifying the risks up front, you create an opportunity to potentially mitigate those risks. And that's a lot of what I do in my practice, is advising companies on some steps they can take in their labeling, in their quality controls, in their compliance, to best position themselves in case there is a threat of products liability down the road. So that's our agenda for today. I'll try to share my screen here if I can. I don't know if I have that. There it is, function. And I'll start a little bit with this FDA process, and in particular on how it's viewed additive manufacturing to date. And before there was really any sort of draft guidance, the FDA has traditionally taken the position that it's business as usual. The majority of the products cleared that are additive manufactured to date have been done so through the 510(k) process. They've been done so through the traditional means by showing that they're substantially equivalent to a predicate device already on the market. Interestingly, most of those predicates are not additive manufactured, which could potentially create an issue down the road or a story or narrative a plaintiff's attorney may like to tell at a trial, but that's how they've been treated to date. And December of 2017, the leapfrog guidance that I mentioned. When we say leapfrog guidance, that's just a term that's used to show that that's the FDA's current thinking on this technology, this innovation at the time. It's not intended to be binding. It's not regulations. It's just something to help hopefully guide manufacturers and suppliers and other companies that are interested in this space. I thought I guess the big takeaway from it is, in essence, it put in writing what I just mentioned, this concept that for the most part, additive manufactured products will still be treated the same way as the same product type would if it was traditionally manufactured. So if you got a hip implant, whether it's additive manufactured or traditionally manufactured, you'd still be going through that 510(k) process, or depending on the device type, potentially even a PMA. Obviously, a lot of your submission will have to detail your manufacturing processes and what type that is. But as far as the form that clearance takes, it would be exactly the same. Two things I want to point out that are not addressed in that 2017 guidance that were interesting at the time are really the two biggest areas for growth, and where I think maybe the most sort of guidance and insight is needed. That's on this idea of point of care manufacturing. That has since been somewhat addressed by a recent discussion paper I'll mention in a second. And then two is this area of biologics, of tissue printing, organ printing, again, a very interesting area, but a bit of a gray area that was not touched upon in these submissions. But again, as I mentioned before, the main concern, I think, with this document is it does a really good job of identifying certain risks and things you need to think about. But it doesn't necessarily give enough detail or put forth regulations to really help shield the companies trying to comply with these. The one example I gave, I think, is a good one from this document. There is a note in there about the risks with the use of recycled powder. That's, of course, acknowledging that the materials used in a 3D print are very expensive. And after every print, there is going to be some excess of raw material. And companies often try to reuse that, recycle it. The FDA notes this could be a concern for manufacturing from a quality control standpoint, and says, hey, you should have some sort of policy, some sort of guidance on how much recycled material could be used from print to print. Again, that's good, but they point out a problem, and there's not necessarily clear guidance on what that policy, what that quality control system should look like. The other thing that I mentioned that's curious, I thought, was or not curious, but is an example of how the FDA can shape the law, is they include a definition of medical device to include software, such that 3D printing and software was included in the definition of a medical device. And while that's significant, that's one of those examples of something that was not addressed by traditional products liability law. Traditionally, software was not considered a product that could be liable to products liability law. The FDA, by making this definition, potentially could shift that trend, make it easy for a plaintiff's attorney to stand up there and say, well, the FDA considers this software, this CAD file to be a medical device, and thus you, Your Honor, you court, should consider this to be a product for products liability purposes. The legal trend is already going there. Obviously, with AI and now with 3D printing, there almost has to be a shift, but this is something traditionally where software wasn't even considered a product for products liability purposes. Just shifting gears, just this past December, I'm sure many of you saw the FDA did come out with at least some insight into how it views this idea of point of care printing. Again, that is printing at the end user site at a healthcare facility where they receive a file and the healthcare facility can in essence print that device right on site for a patient specific need. Again, very exciting innovation. As an initial point, this is just a discussion paper. This is not guidance, it's not recommendations, it's not even current thinking. This is just the FDA putting some stuff out there and trying to elicit some discussion. They actually pose very specific discussion questions for those interested in this area. For those of you who haven't seen it and you can't find it, please let me know. I'd be more than happy to share it. For those of you who are interested in adding to the discussion, I would just note that a week from yesterday, actually, February 7th, is the deadline to submit comments to the extent that you're considering doing so. I think the couple of the biggest takeaways from this discussion are one, and I know from talking with some of my contacts at the FDA, one of the things they're struggling with, and probably why this paper was a little bit delayed, was the treatment of a healthcare facility. And this concept of, do they really want to have healthcare facilities be responsible for FDA regulatory compliance? Again, nothing committed to in this discussion paper, but the answer appears to be yes. Albeit in the most egregious example, where the healthcare facility would be the one sort of designing, developing the software, the product, the CAD file, and then doing the printing. I'm not sure who else could even have responsibility, but the discussion at least suggests that would fall on the healthcare facility. And then number two, it seems like a lot of the other scenarios where it's mixed, the manufacturer would still have a lot of compliance obligations. And that raises a lot of concern. And those are some of the concerns I'll talk about here this morning. But it raises control issues. When a manufacturer may submit a CAD file, it may submit some labeling or even the materials. But at the end of the day, someone else offsite is going to be manufacturing this product. And a lot of the quality controls, a lot of the post-manufacturing inspection, that's going to fall on the HCF, the healthcare facility, but there still may be exposure to that manufacturer. That manufacturer may still be deemed to be the party in control. And so that creates a lot of uncertainties, a lot of things to consider in that scenario. And the other thing that I'll talk about at length here later this morning is this discussion paper underscores the importance of labeling. A lot of the scenarios that are put forth by the FDA for discussion assume that there was labeling that accompanies the product and that the healthcare facility is doing everything in connection with that labeling. And so I think it puts a lot of importance and stress on that labeling, what goes into that labeling, obviously very detailed instructions on things such as the reuse of recycled powders, clearing a print from, or clearing a printer from one print to the next, build paths, temperatures, all sorts of things that have to be considered if you're giving clear instructions to a third party who'd be ultimately printing these devices. The other thing I'd briefly touch upon, obviously I know the FDA doesn't always set forth, standards and guidelines and testing and how to do things. That's often dictated by consensus standards, ISO, ASTM. In the context of additive manufacturing, of course, there is a ASTM committee, ASTM F42. They've been at it for over a decade, developing a lot of standards. Some of the key standards adopted to date are below, but there's plenty of them. But again, this is still a very relatively new technology. And although this committee has done an unbelievable job of spitting out standards very quickly, these standards do not have the same tested time. They don't have the same track record, and they're still open to some questioning, and there's still a lot of standards being developed even as we speak. So I want to switch gears now and talk, now that we kind of have the regulatory framework in place, and talk a little bit about how this kind of ties into my area, which is products liability law and some of the risks that are created. And that's kind of a little bit of a quick overview, a little products liability 101, if you will. And when we're talking about a products liability claim, what we're really talking about is a claim by a patient that they were injured and that their injury was caused by some defect in your product. And that defect can take a number of shapes. It can be a defect in the design of the product, meaning that the product never should have been designed that way to begin with. The risks outweigh the benefits. It could be a defect in the manufacturing process, meaning that the device deviated from its intended design. The third category is a defect in the labeling, that there wasn't proper warnings, there was not proper instructions, and that's what I just mentioned. Although those are the three theories, I'll say above those three theories, there are two sort of main buckets of potential products liability claims. One would be strict liability, and that's no finding of fault needed whatsoever. The plaintiff just has to show the product was defective. Doesn't matter what the intent was or how the company acted. If there's a defect, there's liability. The other category is negligence, and that does require some type of showing. That requires that the company acted unreasonably or not as a reasonable, prudent manufacturer is supposed to act. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about those three buckets briefly of the types of defects that can be alleged against any product. And the first one is a design defect claim, and this is an alleged defect where the manufacturer could have reduced a foreseeable risk by adopting a reasonable and economically feasible alternative design. And usually these are determined by what's called the risk utility test, where they're going to be balancing the risks of this product against its unique benefits. And you're going to look at the probability of injury or the gravity of injury against an alternative design. In 3D printing, there's kind of a low-hanging fruit here well, of course, there's an alternative design, an alternative way of doing this. You can traditionally manufacture the product. And so something I always advise clients in this space when they're looking at getting into additive manufacturing is, why are you additive manufacturing this product? What is your reasoning for doing so? Not just because it's the best new thing, not just because you want to keep up with the Joneses, but there is some unique advantage from 3D printing it. Maybe you can put the coating on in a single print or a single function. You don't have to use multiple materials. That could be a benefit of 3D printing, the fixation options, but you need to make sure you're documenting that and developing that in your company's files. The next area is manufacturing defect claims, and this is an imperfection. It's a deviation from the intended design of the product. And this is the area where I think additive manufacturing adds a lot of risk, adds a lot of wrinkles. There are so many variables when it comes to additive manufacturing a product, and those would be obviously the materials, cleaning the printer from one print to the next, the build path, updates in software, changes in software, the temperature in which the materials have to be kept, the temperature in which the printing is done, the amount of time that something's allowed to cool. And then when you also add in the fact that a lot of these may be done by a third party in the point of care printing situation, and you can see how a lot of things can go wrong, how there can be a lot of risks and wrinkles. And so it's very important that you have all these quality controls in place. Obviously, if you're doing this point of care, you need to make sure that your labeling and instructions are very clear. And also, you want to make sure that you have careful sort of history records. That's another thing that's kind of a wrinkle when it comes to additive manufacturing. Oftentimes, some of the best evidence in defending a manufacturing defect claim is to point to the device history records, the batch records for a given lot, to show, hey, these were inspected. There was no manufacturing deviations found. I can look at the rest of the lot and see that all of these products did well. You lose some of that, obviously, depending on the circumstances when it comes to additive manufacturing, especially point of care. The third and final bucket here I want to just briefly touch upon are failure to warn claims. And these are the ideas that the manufacturer should have, that there's a known risk and the manufacturer did not provide adequate warnings that it should have. And I think, again, especially in this idea of point of care printing, it is critical that these warnings are carefully vetted, that they're a cross-functional effort from the whole company and looking at, talking to R&D, talking to legal, talking to regulatory, and really figuring out what you need to put in there. Because there are a lot of instructions, a lot of things that can go wrong. And depending on what happens, the plaintiff may very well be looking back at you and not at the medical facility where the device is printed. So those are the sort of buckets. I just want to kind of briefly touch upon some of the issues in kind of products liability, some of the things to consider and think about, and then even put forth a couple of scenarios here for discussion or for everyone on the group to consider. And so I mentioned, design defect claims. I talked about already the importance of your device development file and making sure that you're clearly articulating why you're 3D printing any given product. But just another example of how the traditional products liability tenets may not apply to 3D printing is this concept of testing the worst case scenario. Generally speaking, it's understood with traditionally manufactured devices that you don't have to test every single scenario, every single configuration of your products. You test the worst case scenario and to see if it holds up to the various ASTM standards. That's extremely difficult to do in the context of additive manufacturing, especially in the point of care situation, where really the scenarios are somewhat limitless, or can be, because it's whatever the patient specific need would be. And so in that case, if you are only testing to quote unquote your worst case, that needs to be clear in the warnings. That needs to be made up front. There has to be certain parameters and restrictions placed on the labeling and instructions that accompany any sort of CAD file or device materials or 3D package to an HCF. I already mentioned manufacturing defect and a lot of the variables and issues there. The other thing I would note here, as I often get this question a lot at these conferences, is the liability that may sit with a supplier, a material supplier. Obviously, we're talking a lot about regulations here in the FDA, and that often falls upon the manufacturer, who's deemed to be the manufacturer, and not necessarily on the supplier, although obviously they do have FDA requirements, but not necessarily the 510K clearance obligations. That doesn't mean that there's some sort of exemption from products liability law, however. It's often the case that the plaintiffs will go down the chain far enough to find the material supplier if they think that they were somehow responsible and it was their materials that caused this issue and not necessarily the design of the product. And so I always caution, and I'll talk a little bit about it, especially in this context, I caution all clients to carefully consider your contracts. If you're a supplier, carefully consider your manufacturing contracts with your manufacturers. If you're a manufacturer, look carefully at your supply contracts. If you're contracting now with hospitals for printing on site, look carefully at those contracts as well. You want to make sure that there's indemnity in there. You want to understand how, if certain things go wrong, who's responsible, because the plaintiff doesn't really care. They're going to sue whoever they want to sue, and then leave it up to the companies to sort of work it out on the back end as to who's responsible. And finally, then the last bucket and kind of talk about here is this idea of warnings. And again, I think this will go to my scenarios I'll talk about here in a second, but it really does sort of turn this very notion of products liability on its head. And so who even has the duty to warn? The design company with the files, obviously it looks like from this recent FDA oversight and discussion document that they do have an obligation to provide warnings and labeling with their CAD file. But what about the software company? What about the suppliers? What about the printer manufacturer? Do they have a duty to warn? And what do those warnings look like? And then again, what is even the product that contains the labeling? Is it the CAD file? Does a 3D printer have to contain certain labeling? Do the materials that shipped have to include certain labeling? All of these things are uncertain and unclear in this context. And so I was thinking a little bit about some of the scenarios that were put forth by the FDA in their December 10th, 2021 discussion paper. And I just want to raise a couple for the group here and just kind of underscore some of the considerations and things that are very unclear. And so this point of care scenario here is where a manufacturer provides a healthcare facility with really the full 3D printing package. And so software, materials, the CAD file, all that is provided to the HCF for printing. I mean, that's kind of a cleaner example where they control all of the labeling for the materials. There's no variable there for the hospital to go find their own materials. They're providing the software, so software updates can be controlled and all specific to this manufacturer and developer, and obviously the software itself. But the HCF prints the device at its point of care facility on its own printer. And obviously, they're going to be printing other devices. If it's some sort of bone print, like a facial plate, for example, they might be printing other companies' products on that same printer, even because in their mind, it's all bone. But obviously there's a risk of cross-contamination there. And who bears that risk? Does the hospital have some sort of obligation to have a quality control system for cleaning out the print from one to another, because obviously if there's a cross-contamination of materials, that can affect the integrity of the product. That could lead to a manufacturing defect claim. Of course, the manufacturer in that package can provide labeling that says how you have to go about cleaning and reducing the risk of cross-contamination from one print to the next. It can include clear instructions that you should not print any other materials other than materials provided on this printer ever. That might be obviously a non-starter for the healthcare facility for a variety of reasons, but you can at least include that warning in there. The point being, though, it may not matter, at least from who gets sued originally, because if the product is defective, if there is some sort of manufacturing defect, it's likely the initial lawsuit will be filed against that manufacturer who provided the package. And then it leads to a potentially messy battle when the manufacturer has to decide whether or not to bring in its customer and to add its customer to the lawsuit, or if it needs to have some sort of battle with its customer outside of the lawsuit. But that is why the contracts are so important, and who bears those responsibilities and how indemnity would flow to hopefully avoid those situations. Scenario 2 is a similar scenario, and I know we're running short on time and I want to definitely get to questions. But this one's a little murkier, where the manufacturer provides only the CAD file and the HFC then contracts separately, or excuse me, HCF contracts separately for software and materials. And then there is the software requires an update, the hospital runs that update, and for whatever reason, that update impacts sort of the build path of the device. And now the build path is faster than it was before. That impacts the integrity of the device as it's not hardening or solidifying as slowly as it's supposed to under the specific manufacturer specifications. And so that raises a lot of unique issues. Is that software company on the hook? Is the healthcare facility on the hook for not understanding or noting the difficulties that could ensue with that software update? Did the manufacturer not properly warn? Should they have provided their own software? So it just raises a lot of interesting questions with a lot of people potentially pointing the finger. And so those are all things that need to be worked out or considered. And that's why, again, I would just note anyone interested in chiming in on that discussion, they have until next Monday to do so. So I know I only have a few minutes left, but Rachel, if anyone has any questions or anything else I can answer, happy to do so. Also, here's my contact information. I'm more than happy to continue this conversation offline. Thanks, Rachel.
No, thank you, Sean. That's great. Okay, we do have 2 minutes, and then we'll get through them very quickly. So,
yeah, let's do it.
The point of care discussion paper you mentioned, is that on FDA's website, or is there somewhere on your website that links to?
It's on the FDA website. I'm also happy but if you just Google FDA point of care discussion paper, December 2021, it's the first thing that pops up. But it is on the FDA website. Sorry for this amateur use of technology, but that is the cover of it for anyone who's looking for it. And it's very interesting. It goes through a number of scenarios. To me, the most interesting discussion is that one that I kind of honed in on, where it's really a manufacturer just kind of sending a CAD file or maybe some more materials to a third party and letting them print it. That to me is where a lot of these questions need to be answered.
Okay, we've got one question. It may be too much to get through in 1 minute, so maybe it would be better if you go and take a look at the Q&A, but it's around HCF producing point of care 3D printed products.
Okay.
So if you want to take a quick look.
Yeah, I'll take a look at it.
I think it might be too hard to answer live.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so, and you've done a great job keeping this on track. The last thing I want to do is impede that. So thank you very much, Rachel. I appreciate it.
You're wonderful. Thank you, Sean. Really appreciate that. Okay, everyone, we are officially done hour 2 of this 3-hour program. I do want to say thank you all for sticking with us for the last 2 hours. I don't know if you all can see how many people are on the line joining us, but there's just a little bit under 300, so that's wonderful. It's a great crowd, and I've enjoyed spending most of the morning with you. So we do have our keynote speaker up next. Before we move on, though, I do want to take one more opportunity, since it's probably the last time I'll have, to say thank you to our sponsors and partners for this webinar and joining us. So just a quick shout out again, excuse me, to Veeva, RQM Plus, Covington, and Duane Morris. They've brought you outstanding content for the last 2 hours. And I really can't thank them enough for being wonderful partners and series sponsors of our program. I also want to thank our partners at RAPS Boston and ASQ Medical Device. Do this without their promotion and support. So appreciate them as well. So with that, I am going to tee up our last session, our keynote discussion, by welcoming both Seth Goldenberg from Veeva Medtech and Dr. Jeff Shuren of the FDA. So you both can turn your cameras on if you want to say hi to everybody really quickly and everyone can see you.
Hi, everyone.
Turn this up real quick. Okay, great. So we are going to get started with Dr. Shuren. I'm going to turn the floor over to you for a presentation, and then Seth, I will ask you to lead some very, very interesting and arousing Q&A with Dr. Shuren. So just keep in mind, folks, the Q&A button is available at the bottom of the screen. We are going to have, I'm sure, a lot of questions, and we will try to get through as much as we possibly can in the next hour. But please note, if your questions are not answered, we'll make sure that everyone on the program gets the transcript later, and they may be able to reach out and answer those questions offline. So just keep that in mind. We'll do as much as we possibly can, but we want to leave plenty of time for discussion. So Dr. Shuren, I will turn things over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Rachel. Really a pleasure to talk with everyone. I wish I could be there in person, although probably not right now.
2 feet of snow is not a good idea for you.
Oh my God, I heard more's on the way too. So I have family in the area and they're just unbelievable. Well, hang in there. I'm going to just start. I'm going to take a few minutes. Really want to start by talking about the past year. I'm going to put up some slides. So hopefully, let's see if we can get these going. Let's see. Can you see the slides?
We can see the slides, but they are not in presenter mode. So just keep in mind, you can see the panel on the left-hand side, but we can see them.
All right, well, I won't waste too much time here. Sorry about that, just looking for my button for switching these over. Sorry. Well, why don't,
oh, someone says F5. If that's
oh, bless
helpful.
you. Because normally there's another, you see, I'm supposed to oversee the Center for Technology, and you can see how capable I am.
I was trying to figure out how to tell you, and I'm like, I don't know. I'd go to slideshow at the top, and I would try to figure it out that way.
All right, I did F5. Fantastic. Whoever had that suggestion, by the way, if you have a 510K, we will expedite that immediately. Thank you very much. So anyway, I want to take a few minutes. Just I know folks are interested on what's going to happen in 2022. A lot of it kind of is premised in what's gone on in 2021. So I thought I'd take a few minutes to talk about that. And just a little bit of setting the table. You know, CDRH, we have about 1,900 people. We're responsible, though, for overseeing over 230,000 different kinds of medical devices. Just phenomenal number that industry has out there. And that's from about 25,000 companies, device companies. And last year, give you an idea, we had to deal with around 19,000 submissions coming in the door. So a lot of work. Our top priority.
Dr. Shuren, you actually are in notes mode. So
I'm in notes mode.
Yes. So if you want to go to, I apologize for this. I wish I could tell you how to do it. Maybe you did it. It works.
It worked. Okay. There we go. So anyway, and thank you for that. You know, our top priority has been COVID-19, but it's not our only priority. However, it has eaten up much of our workload. What you can see on the slide here is that over the course of the pandemic, we have helped facilitate product coming to market, and we've used our special emergency use authorization authorities as well as full marketing authorization authorities. And combined, we have now authorized over, sorry about that. Believe it or not, this is scan mail. So we have now authorized over 2,000 medical devices for COVID-19. And these come in the door in what we call emergency use authorization requests, or some of them. And what I have on the screen too is a number of EUAs and supplements and something we call a pre-EUA, the opportunity for a developer to work with our reviewers in near or real time to answer their questions, solve problems, and look at data on a rolling basis. And the combined number of EUAs and pre-EUAs for COVID has been around 7,500 coming in the door. And that's in part driving a lot of these medical devices coming to market. We've also engaged in a variety of other kinds of outreach besides the pre-EUAs through guidance documents and a lot of webinars and town halls. In fact, we've held almost 100 of them over the course of the pandemic to try to answer questions for developers and provide updated information. We fielded over 400,000 inquiries. We've engaged in a number of partnerships. One of the exciting ones has been with NIH in their RADx program. We've been working with them from day one on this. And it's really a Shark Tank approach for identifying and then facilitating the development of point of care and at-home tests, in this case for COVID. But we think this has been very successful, and we hope we'll see government funding to support this kind of approach for other kinds of products moving forward, certainly other kinds of tests that we can really help developers get to yes more expeditiously. Of course, with all that pandemic work coming in the door, it has had an adverse impact on our ability to do other work in the center. I know many companies may have experienced that. We have taken a number of steps to try to get on top of it. As I showed you, the large volume of COVID work coming in the door. In fact, those EUAs and pre-EUAs account for over 25% of our pre-market review work. But we've taken a number of steps to try to deal with that high workload, as well as dealing with the non-COVID pre-market submissions. And already, as a result, we have reduced the number of overdue files by 39%. And our goal in 2022 is to sort of right the ship as much as possible. And we think we're probably going to get there, or maybe close to there, for most of the center. The one big exception is going to be for in vitro diagnostics. They have been hit the hardest in the pandemic. They've got the most EUAs and pre-EUAs. We know it's going to take a little bit longer, but already we're starting to see some good progress in that space. To help facilitate transition, moving out of sort of the pandemic scenario to back to normal operations, there are two issues for us on the table and for you. One is for those products that have gotten emergency use authorization, expectations to then transition to a full marketing authorization or otherwise come off the marketplace. The second is that we have put out several guidances that allow greater flexibility for developers to either put some new products on the market or to make modifications to products already having a full marketing authorization without having to come to the FDA for pre-market review. We have recently issued two guidances, one on that EUA transition, one for transitioning out of those policies, on what our expectations would be to either get full marketing authorization, what would be the timeframes, or to move from those enforcement discretion policies, again, to have authorized product on the marketplace. Those guidances are currently out for public comment. Those comments are due by March 23rd. If you're interested in hearing more about those guidances, besides looking at them yourselves, we are going to have a webinar on February 22nd about that. And we will give advance notice for when the transition would occur. We are proposing a 180-day transition period. If your product on the market under an EUA and you need to have a pre-market submission, what we're proposing is that that submission be in the door by the 180-day mark. But if we have it, then you can continue to market the product while your submission is under review. Just yesterday, we put out a report on some of our accomplishments in 2021, a little bit on COVID, but focused on a variety of other actions that we took. And I just want to spend a minute to highlight some of those. First off, we continue to have really a great year in authorization of novel medical devices. And most of these are not COVID devices. You see, in 2021, we authorized 103 novel technologies. And you can also see what the pattern has been on a little over a decade, just really a nice steady increase. And around 2017, 2018, we hit historic highs for the 40+ year history of the medical device program as regards authorization of novel technologies. 2020, that big bump up was really driven by COVID. But very excited to see the numbers in 2021, which I'll tell you personally, I never expected these numbers to remain as high. But I think it shows that there's a healthy pipeline of impressive technology coming to the US marketplace. And even more exciting in the setting of some of the challenges we faced in pre-market review for non-COVID products because of the pandemic. So very exciting looking forward. Some of the products we authorized, about 13 of them, had a breakthrough device designation. And under our breakthrough device designation program, we have seen that every year, the number of medical devices that get a breakthrough device designation is greater than the year before. Also a terrific sign of a very healthy pipeline for MedTech. Last year, we put out a proposed rule to create a new category for hearing aids that would allow for their sale over the counter. And the goal here is to facilitate innovation as well as to drive greater patient accessibility. And that's currently out for public comment. We also continued our efforts in patient engagement, and we have seen a steady increase in the use of patient-reported outcomes in clinical studies and the use of patient preference information in support of FDA pre-market authorization decisions. Really very exciting to see these different measures being adopted and used so that, in effect, what matters a lot to patients and the value judgments of patients are really getting incorporated in the evidence generation to support product approvals, clearances, and being submitted to the FDA. And we're using that in our decision-making as well. To help facilitate that, we recently put out additional guidance on patient-reported outcomes. We also just put out guidance on ways of engaging patients in the design of clinical trials. Important that we consider what's important to patients in our establishment and our conduct of clinical studies. One of our priorities over the past few years has been what we call collaborative communities. We engage in collaboration all the time. So what's unique here is that these are ongoing forums where the key stakeholder groups in a community come together to address common problems and to achieve, shared outcomes and develop shared solutions. In this context, FDA participates as a member of that community. And if the community has a solution and it's in the best interests of public health, it's not contrary to our statutory mandates, we'll look to adopt that solution as ours. So it's really putting the community in the driving seat. Very different approach than has been used before. And we took steps a few years ago to put in place expectations on the creation of these kinds of communities. And we set a goal that by the end of 2020, we would participate in at least 10, and we hit that goal. And last year, we joined another 2. So already 12 such communities in existence and several more under development. We see this as a key piece for how we would do business in the future. Digital health also remains a top priority for us. Last year, we put out an action plan on artificial intelligence, machine learning-based software as a medical device that laid out some of the key actions that we would take as a center. And a number of those are underway, and you'll start seeing some of that here in 2022. We also put out a list of technologies that are AI, machine learning enabled that we have authorized. And that's over 300. In fact, in 2021, we authorized over 50 of that, 300 plus. So we've just seen a continued steady increase in the number of such technologies. Really very exciting products come into the marketplace. We also have been working with colleagues in other countries like Health Canada and the UK for putting out guiding principles on good machine learning practices, and other efforts are underway today as well. One of our top initiatives is on medical device quality. One aspect of that is on advanced manufacturing. The use of technologies in manufacturing or other parts of the enterprise that can create efficiencies, improve productivity, reduce defects, to do more automated, easier for keeping record keeping, and ultimately, hopefully helping to drive down costs. To help facilitate this, last year, we launched what we call an advanced manufacturing clearinghouse with an independent third party who is looking at such technologies that may be using by some in the device industry or used in other industries, doing an assessment, coming up with the pros and cons, and then we'll put that out in white papers for then companies to use to make better informed decisions in the use of technologies in their manufacturing or in other aspects of their operations. One of the challenges we face as a center has been our own IT. We had over 30 different systems. They were legacy, they're siloed. We've got reviewers, for example, they go in and out of databases all day. And it just didn't make sense to continue that. So a few years ago, we made the decision, let's not throw good money after bad, if you will. We need to move to agile platforms and have data in the cloud. And we got the blessing of the agency to go ahead and do that. We call this digital transformation. Well, that has now been launched. We were able to get additional dollars from Congress to help support this. And what last year we did is launch what we call the decision management portal. Now, this is internal for CDRH, but what it does is it allows our staff to have a one-stop shopping. They just go through one portal to get the different pieces that they need. So no longer bouncing in and out of different databases. That's what we're trying to do with this portal, and now starting to streamline and put in place a variety of different business operations. One of the earlier ones was for our handling of medical device reports. But a complementary piece to this is our customer collaboration portal. So this is what industry and others would see, and it becomes sort of a one way of getting into the system in order to provide information to us and ultimately to create a virtual workspace. Some of our early efforts has been to create an electronic submission for industry. And this is under our eStar program. So we had piloted this submission. And what's different is that rather than a company just taking what they have and putting in a PDF, we set this up in a more structured format that better goes along with the electronic template that our reviewers use when they do a review. And it better structures this, and over time, we'll also start putting in more questions and decision aids to allow companies to have a much better structured submission, which allows us to do a more efficient review. And less likely we may be asking questions about where particular information is. In fact, we think this is so helpful for anyone who uses one of these submissions. We waive that 15-day quality check that we do before we decide whether or not to accept that submission into a 510K review. So already time savings from anyone who does it. Did as a pilot. Last year, we launched this formally, and any company can take advantage of this for a traditional 510K. It's voluntary. And just recently, we launched that capability for de novos. So I think a big win if you take advantage for both companies and for the FDA. Finally, just want to mention one of the metrics that we look at is on customer service, and particularly around customer satisfaction. We've been doing this for several years, and we set a goal that ultimately We want to get to over 90%. You can see our performance over time, kind of the low 80s bumping up to the high 80s. And then really the past 2 years, we've been over 90%. And really very pleased to see that, particularly in the setting of the pandemic, which I know has created such stress on the system and for others, but still trying to provide the best customer service that we can. So I'm going to stop there. And that gives you a little bit of a window of what we've been doing. And then I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. Really appreciate it. And good to be speaking with you again today. Just a reminder to the folks, you can put the questions into the Q&A and I'll do my best to facilitate the questions. So while folks are putting questions in, first of all, thanks again to you and the staff of the agency for doing everything you're doing. All the reviews during COVID and EUAs have been really impressive. I know the comment period is ending, as you said, right, end of March. Right? When do you expect, if you have a ballpark, when that transition period would likely begin? Because I know a lot of folks are interested.
Yeah. So it's not as if we have some particular date in mind. We thought it was important to get this out there, give industry and other members of the public an opportunity to comment. So we kind of set this in place. And then we'll see what the trigger is. Of course, if the Secretary of HHS decides to withdraw the declaration that there's an emergency in place, that is likely to be a trigger for when we would go ahead and ask for folks to start to transition. It's possible we may do that at an earlier time. It sort of depends what the needs are in the country and where we sit. So if there's no longer the need for having emergency use authorizations, then we'll move towards transition.
No, that's good. One of the unique opportunities from of the EUA is you actually have all this real world evidence, right? Your product's been out there, on the market. Do you have any particular recommendations for real world evidence or other considerations that are, key themes in the guidance that industry should be paying attention to as they start on that journey towards clearance and approval?
Yeah. Well, anytime you're going to be using clinical data to support a marketing authorization decision, you got real world evidence. We're always the key points are, is it relevant and sufficiently reliable for us to make a decision on? Is it sufficiently robust? So my suggestion is, if you've got access to real world data, you want to have real world evidence, talk to us first about it. So we come to all get on the same page as to what we'll go ahead and support marketing authorization.
No, that's great. Appreciate that. And maybe you can speak a little bit about, I don't want to use the new normal term, but maybe the next normal for the FDA, right, after COVID, right? And maybe what, lessons that have been learned from this, really significant increase in reviews, right, of EUAs. Are there any best practices that you're looking to bring into the future?
Well, certainly coming out of we're not even out of the pandemic. So the new normal, first of all, I anticipate there's going to be a lot more virtual interactions than we had before. And there's lots of efficiencies to be had. I think a lot of companies are already seeing the value of, we'll do more work in the virtual space. But one of the big lessons learned was the value of engagement. I mentioned these pre-EUAs, and particularly early in the pandemic, before we got the big tsunami of pre-EUAs and EUAs in the door, we truly had our folks working with the developers in real time. Literally several times a day, back and forth, phone calls and emails, problem solved. And I think that combined with the flexibility that we had in our EUA authorities was the secret sauce for rapidly accelerating product coming to market, where we could truly squash that time. And I'd like to see that happen in peacetime. In fact, we have a proposal on the table as part of MDUFA 5 reauthorization called the Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program, TPLC Advisory Program, or TAP. And the real focus on TAP is to provide that kind of engagement, close to it, I'll say, in peacetime. That's what it's all about, because we already have seen what a difference it makes, as opposed to today's world where if you really have, meaty topics to talk to us about, you can ask for a preset, and then put in your request. You got your 70 days, and we'll get to you with, written responses. Meet if you still want to. You got new questions, you can throw in another request. So move away from that stage gate, get to much more fluid interactions.
No, that's great to hear, because I know, that's been, several initiatives, EFS, which turned into Breakthrough, right? Kind of the feeling behind that was more collaborative engagement and review. So it's great to hear continuing moving that, but talking about MDUFA, right? Obviously it's been delayed. Are there any potential impacts to industry that folks need to be aware of?
Well, for MDUFA 5, I don't know ultimately what MDUFA 5 will look like. I will say, one of the downsides for things taking too long is our ability to get started on MDUFA 5. In our prior user fee discussions, when we kind of reach a chord, if there's additional money we can use out of the carryover, we typically have agreed, we're going to apply that to get going with the next MDUFA, get a jump start on it, and there's value all around. That's not something we've been able to do because we're not yet in a place for agreement on a package. We still are having, good discussions. So we're all headed in the right direction. But we kind of were hoping this would be wrapped up earlier, and then we could be moving forward on MDUFA 5 and making, smart investments. And that's kind of been held up because the discussions are going on so long.
Got it. Fair enough. And it was great to hear about the digital transformation progress, right? I think last time we spoke, you have your famous spaghetti slide, right, of all the different systems. Are those systems still there, and you're taking, hey, let's create a simplified environment, or are you guys continuing a simplification journey as well, but behind the scenes?
Oh, there is a simplification journey. So those, they're disappearing little by little. It's kind of an Agatha Christie mystery. We're eventually getting to maybe more like, and then there was one, is the idea. But yes, they're starting to go away, and over time, they'll disappear. We already have our sort of key platform set up, and now it's starting to roll things in and building capabilities. I'll just add, complementary to this, we have engaged in an extensive business process improvement effort that we've now baked in as an ongoing part of the medical device program. So we have, leaned out or redesigned now almost 90% of our core business processes. And we're going to continue to do that on an iterative basis. And then, of course, it'll be those new processes that are getting folded into digital transformation, as really the IT being an enabler for those work processes.
No, that's great to hear. And actually, the first session today actually talked about that, where Jennifer Cook was talking about her transformation and how the business process change was a key part of that journey. So, which is right, you can't have old processes in new systems and expect it to be successful, right, or get the most value. So that's great to hear as well. Continuing down the line, one question that is in the Q&A, and we heard about eStar. Are there any other plans for more direct electronic submissions, right, as part of this journey? Because right now things are still going through the doc center, right, even e-copy. Maybe just to get a little, I know this might be a little far forward, but about what the vision is for the future.
Well, the vision is we would like to see it as you have, a more simple, straightforward portal for being able to provide those submissions and other information. We want to get to a point where it's more of a one-stop shop for a company as well, that you could sort of do all of your business through one place. You can do all your banking at one location. Would be the nice way of doing it. But also what you provide to us, changing that sort of structure so that it is more a rational approach, I'll say. We talk about rational templates. And then the ability to have back and forth and work with us in a common virtual workspace, that we're not just sending something over, here's something by email, but can we get in there and do things? If we're working on labeling, can we just sit there and do the work, real time on it? Or if you're sending in materials and we have a back and forth, can we do that and maybe annotate things together in real time or at separate time, but we can see what work is done in a common virtual space.
Got it. So that's a great point on the virtual side, right? And one of the things that I know began during the pandemic was, these remote regulatory assessments, right, or virtual inspections. I know inspections have been on, they've been paused, right, going back and forth, right, based on the pandemic. Is there, any further thinking on, true remote inspections where 483s are issued, right? Because I know the remote regulatory assessment doesn't actually end in that, have that endpoint. But again, just curious if you're getting more comfortable through that experience, through this virtual efficient world, and if inspections might be something in the future as well that takes advantage of that.
There has been a lot of discussion and interest in the FDA in having a remote inspection model. So, but I'm going to talk now on a personal level, so you can't take this as agency. But my anticipation is that's where we're going to end up. And it isn't that all inspections can be done remotely.
Right.
Or some inspections, maybe part of it can be done remote, but some things you just got to throw eyes on. There's no way around it. You're looking at, clean room operations, kind of hard to do some of these things remotely. But to the extent they can be, I am anticipating that's where the agency will end up. And certainly we look to what other countries are doing as well. And we're getting a little bit of that exposure, for example, what Europe is doing in some of their audits. And that's through our medical device single audit program. We're getting some learnings out of that I think will help inform the agency.
No, that's great. And that makes sense. Going back to, my stint at the FDA, right, where you have like the generalists out in the field, get eyes on it, right, but have the experts kind of behind the scene, that hybrid approach that you just described. Sounds great. Excellent. Just want to make sure I'm keeping track of the questions in there as well. So, you guys have been pretty busy lately. This is the UAs. I feel like there's a lot of guidances out right now that are coming out or getting issued. The most recent one that you mentioned, right, the patient reported outcome, component of that, is great to see, and getting the patient feedback as part of that life cycle, right? That's always been a big part of development, especially for the payer side, right? Like usually payer discussions are very patient centric, right? Because that is an indicator of compliance. And it's great to see pulling that into the FDA regulatory review as well. Can you just talk a little bit more about the background behind that and kind of what led, to that? Was there patient advocacy groups coming in, or is this something the FDA was seeing themselves that led to the creation of this guidance?
This, I will say, the effort on, patient reported outcomes or any of this about a perspective of the patient was something we had started several years ago. I want to say it's more like 2013 or so, where we started to set up our patient engagement, really science of patient input efforts, and try to drive what are the ways in which we can better understand patient perspectives and assess what matters to patients in ways that we can have confidence in the results so we can use them in decision making. So beyond we have a conversation, tell me what's important to you, right? That's what's behind this. And over the years, that has really transitioned to an increasingly greater role of patients in the work that we do, moving from simple engagement to truly partnering with a lot of the patients, incorporating patients more and more in the work that we do in the establishment of the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee, just patients and patient reps sitting there providing recommendations, to the center. So the driver here, this has been a journey. That's why I describe it this way. It's not as if some event occurred. This has been a journey. And I will say in the past few years, this is truly a partnership with us, patient groups and others that are driving the work that you're seeing coming out of the center and the agency. And it's only going to increase over time.
That's great. I mean, one of the things that we're building for our customers, right, as part of our vision to support decentralized trials, is ePro, right? Like having this delivered in an electronic patient-reported outcomes. Are there any additional considerations for how data could be collected, especially when it's an electronically delivered patient result that industry needs to be aware of?
Well, we have put out, there is guidance out from the agency on the use of, sort of the digital tools on data collection and their use in clinical trials. And first of all, I think we're increasingly going to see clinical studies that themselves that are more decentralized. Obviously, a little hard to do those parts in which you have an implantable device. We haven't got to the point yet where we can do the implants remotely, but who knows? Industry is creative. But as part of that data generation piece, can we do that increasingly remotely? And the answer is yes. We have a number of work streams around that, including through the MDIC effort of the National Evaluation System for Health Technology, or NEST. And that includes a variety of different tools and different sources of information. One of the big areas now is patient-generated information. How can we collect that, and how can we do it in a way that we have confidence in the results, right? Are we getting sufficiently quality data that we can make informed decisions on? That's one of the hot topics right now. Technology itself is playing a critical role in that. The other piece is data that's generated by a medical device itself that's being used for a clinical indication. So it's not a tool solely for the purpose of here's how you provide information. It is a treatment, for example, but have the opportunity to collect data and then share that data.
No, that's great. And I'm excited about the decentralized, trials also, because I think will help quite a bit with, equity in clinical trials as well, right? More diverse patient populations and things of that nature. I do want to just be mindful of time, and maybe we'll come back to the clinical trial piece, but it'd be good to get an update, some requests in the question as well as mine on the quality system transition, right? And moving to 13485. I know there's been talks about a few years. Maybe you can just give an update on where you are and maybe what that journey might look like. Is it going to be a big bang overnight? Everything, we're following these standards, or is it going to be, a stage gate based on whether it's risk classification of devices, industry, that kind of what your vision is there.
Yeah. Well, first off, the rule is kind of in its last stages for administration clearance. So I'm trying to keep my fingers crossed that it will be out the door, soon, but we don't get the final say over that. I also want to be respectful, since that rule isn't cleared yet, that, there's only so much I can say about it because it's not that done deal coming out the door. That said, the goal is that, and again, this is going to be proposed, so folks can provide public, comment on it, and, we'll look at it. The goal is, what's that balance of the right time frame for implementation? And whatever we put out there as the time from when the final rule is issued to when it would go into effect, is to keep in mind we're also looking at the time it takes from a proposed rule to go out the door, get the public comment, go through it all, and finally issue the final rule. And that takes time, because the ISO standard is the ISO standard, right? It will evolve itself through, the ISO TC 210 committee. They'll go through all that, but that's there. So once that's out, companies really should be thinking about, great, then why don't I go ahead and just start with what do I need to do, if anything, for making that transition, and not really waiting for a final rule to come into play, because a lot of things folks can get on top of in advance.
That's good advice. Appreciate it. Understanding the constraints not being official yet. There's a lot of other things, as part of the 1345, right? There's more third-party, there's more third-party auditors in Europe, right? That, the different inspection. Are there other things that the FDA may be considering as well as part of that transition, or are you just focused on the 1345 piece today?
It's more on the 1345 piece, and you could anticipate, it'll be FDA inspections for now. Look, let's walk before we run. Mm-hmm. But certainly then thereafter becomes the discussions about, well, what about third parties playing more of a role here? We certainly have that separately, though, with MDSAP. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine over time, as things are worked out in the MDSAP program, and we have that experience doing our inspections straight to the ISO standard, that they can both marry up at that point, right? Because MDSAP has the documentation. It'll use their things we need on the FDA side. How do we start to, address those two? Maybe we get to better alignment, so we're better able to leverage, and vice versa. And then you could see maybe using more and more of the third-party audits to do some of the work that we do ourselves today.
Got it. I appreciate that. I mean, one of the other things that we're seeing, I know industry is challenged with right now, in Europe especially, is increased post-market surveillance or post-market, data that is required. I know the FDA has been, has a trend, right, and in that direction already. Is there any other, comments that you want to bring up or vision for shifting that burden to post-market or an increase in post-market surveillance in general that industry should be aware of from the FDA?
I think so. It's a great question, and I would look at it as there are two aspects. There's one of just post-market surveillance, period, untethered to pre-market, and we are certainly looking at ways for having more effective post-market surveillance. I'm not into the, is it more, is it less? It's sort of, the value of what we're getting on it. We've got an effort for trying to develop more of an active surveillance system. Not that we've turned around and said that industry, you have to do, but can we work out the kinks here and see that as a complementary effort to the other kinds of information we get in the door? Then there is this issue about, are there opportunities where we could shift some of the pre-market data to post-market? That has been a big effort on our part for years. I'll tell you, the biggest constraint we have is the law. We are stuck a lot of times with cookie cutter pathways that we do not have the kind of flexibility that would allow us to make those kinds of shifts, if you will, on pre-market, post-market that we otherwise might do. I think one of the big areas that would be positively impacted if we could is digital health technologies.
Yeah, that's a good perspective, and understanding the burden of having Congress for your boss, right? That you guys are underneath, and having the legal staff to do what you want to move at that pace.
I know the law, it just keeps getting in the way.
Yeah.
Such a bother.
That's great. So again, let's pivot a little bit maybe to another topic that you brought up, which is artificial intelligence and machine learning, right? There's actually, if people want more talks, right after ours, MDIC is actually holding a forum on their artificial intelligence and machine learning working document that I was happy to be a part of. Maybe just talk a little bit more about, you mentioned 50 products being cleared, right, or approved that had an AI or ML component, right? There's quite a bit of work where that's been used to train a system, right? Versus how much is it still learning once it's in the marketplace, right? Could you just talk a little bit about your perspective on how you see that shifting in the comfort level of trained tools, right, versus ones that are evolving in the field, so to speak?
Yeah. Again, hot topic, and I'm glad you flagged the MDIC event coming afterwards. So of course, the issue becomes, if you have a technology that's out there and it is now being modified out in the wild, do you have the right kind of controls on it so you avoid mischief? That's kind of top of mind. And two, you want to make sure if its goal is to add value, it's providing that value that you think that it's doing. And so you can look at it in different scenarios. Is this a technology that it's learning, but you kind of do it in a stage, and then you stop it, you assess it, and you move on? Is it freely modifying itself continually? And then what is it being used for too, right? That risk-based approach. Is this something that's, treating a life-threatening condition, or is this more of it's just providing information or recommendations to people? So we think about those on that kind of risk-based approach. But what we're dealing with now is something called change management protocols. Namely, the opportunity to identify in advance, here's the kinds of changes we would see being made with this AI/ML enabled product. And here's how we go about sort of validating those changes and assuring, right, we're not leading to mischief. And that if we are in any way, making changes, that in fact they're doing what we think it's doing. And if you can lay that out in advance, then there may be the opportunity to, if you will, authorize the technology with that protocol and the kinds of then changes, allowing for those changes to be made without coming back to the FDA. Here's what we sort of face in difficulties, though. There's a science issue around it, that we deal with today, not just with validation, but around the data being used. Is the data truly fit for purpose? Or do we deal with data that's incomplete or it's biased? Big issue we're dealing with in AI/ML today. The second is around just the regulatory approach that we take. I mentioned the law being a barrier. Here's where it kind of ends up being a barrier to do these kind of protocols I talked about. It means in a lot of cases, products are going to come in under de novo. Because then to set that in place and have the controls and on it, we've got to do that with then special controls coming out of the de novo. If we had the law change to give us more flexibility, we could think about very different frameworks around this, and frameworks that start shifting more to the post-market setting. It's something we've talked about for a few years. We call it agile regulation. The idea is you don't change the standard to market, right? Reasonable assurance, safety, and effectiveness. You don't change least burdensome. But rather than you have to do A, B, C, and D if you're 510K, or here you have to do PMA, we say, no, here's the parameters. Let us identify the building blocks and put together that pathway that better fits the technology and make it voluntary. And then developers we could do it the old way, or you just built us a more modern approach. We like that one, we'll use that one if you want. Again, you get the option. And our view is that new pathway should not be any more burdensome than the current pathway. And if we had that flexibility, we could redesign how these products get to market. And there's a whole host of different kinds of technologies that we would see benefiting, having a much more efficient way to get to the marketplace and providing those reasonable assurances of safety and effectiveness. So it's my hope if we can solve that legal problem, the law, then we can provide, I think, a dramatic return on investment for developers. And I think ultimately it's going to be for patients.
Right. No, I agree. I think it's really interesting space, right? It has a long history in digital pathology, digital radiology, but now we're also starting to see digital therapeutics, right, that have clear clinical outcomes. So it's rapidly expanding space, and that's great. Great feedback. Maybe one other. We have a couple more minutes, right? One area that I'm interested in is really the emergence of precision diagnostics, precision treatments, right, which ties in a little bit to that equity in clinical trials, right? Do you have the right patient population, diversity of those patient populations? And again, there's just some gravity, right? Companies want to use tier 1 research centers, right? That select, they're in a certain demographic area, right? That might produce some of those challenges. Is there anything that the FDA is exploring to further promote? I know there's some women's health guidances that have come out, right, as an example, but further promote or enhance diversity in clinical trials?
Yeah. So the answer is there is more to come. I'm going to put a teaser out there. How's this? I talked a lot about things we did in 2021 and then a little bit of a look at 2022. You could anticipate that very soon we're going to put out our strategic priorities for 2022 to 2025. Don't be shocked if you see something in there that starts talking about addressing these issues around health equity and including kind of the role that technology can play. Because we talked a lot about digital health technologies, including those that are AI/ML enabled. And we think one of the linchpins to more equitable healthcare is digital health technologies. Mm-hmm. How we can push that, how we can also push care increasingly to a home setting, regardless of what demographic that you're in. And again, these technologies will play a critical role. Tied in with that too you can see more and more efforts on our part for devices, even if they're not thought about initially as digital health. How do we get into home, like tests? How do we increasingly put, tests in the home setting that, people can use an over-the-counter test, and then maybe those results are provided, digitally back to providers.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think maybe that's one, looking at silver linings of COVID, right? I think everyone's very comfortable or more comfortable with at-home testing now, right? I mean, I have my closet full of COVID tests to keep my kids in school, right? So as a parent of young kids. No, that's great. Let's see if there's any other questions that I'm missing here the last couple minutes here. But that's great to hear, and I'm excited to hear that kind of breaking, not quite breaking news, but we'll watch out for it on the health equity side. Let's see. We do have one question. I just want to make sure I'm addressing other issues here, and maybe actually this ties into that home use, right? Digital health tools is cybersecurity, right? I believe you have a new cybersecurity chief that's there, right? As we go more digital, more remote, right? Device security, and especially if it's in the home getting transmitted, right? Can you talk a little bit about your focus on the cybersecurity front, maybe what might be coming as these technologies are evolving, and the FDA's focus in that side?
Yeah, this has been important to us as a center. We've been out there trying to put different policies in place on expectations on, if you will, good cyber hygiene, and what the expectations would be on both the pre-market and the post-market side, trying to work collaboratively, not just with developers, but in the researcher community, if you will. It used to be called hackers, right? And we would tell people, hire a hacker, get someone to kick the tires. And then developing sort of these spaces for information sharing, the ISALs and the ISACs. In the past year, we worked with MDIC to put out a playbook on threat modeling for our cybersecurity threat modeling, also documents on strengthening cybersecurity practices for medical device servicing, and also on principles for communicating cybersecurity vulnerabilities to patients. This coming year can anticipate updates in our pre-market review guidance. We continue to learn, so expect that you'll start to see the latest learnings move into that document. Also, there's a lot of focus now around a software bill of materials being put out there. As more of the world becomes, and healthcare becomes interconnected, then knowing what software is being used in technology is so important. Because if your system, there are changes being made that's going to have implications for the system that you're plugged into, and transparency around that can help avoid what has turned into vulnerabilities in the healthcare system and healthcare facilities that otherwise can be more proactively addressed. So anticipate more about all of those in the coming year.
This is good. And then maybe one other question here, again, just making sure things get addressed, is on the medical device supply chain, right, and the shortage prevention program, right? I know there's been some changes there, right, to address some of those challenges, right? There's been, I know MassMEDIC, for example, has been active in, chip priority for medical devices, right, versus other industries. Can you just talk a little bit about any progress in the supply chain program?
Gotcha. Well, I'll tell you, before COVID, we never had any base funding for a device supply chain program. In fact, we also only had about $500,000 for cybersecurity. So everything we were building was out of whole cloth beforehand. It's even why when the COVID hit, we pulled about 130 people for supply chain efforts, because we never had that investment. But thanks to Congress, we have gotten some money in COVID supplementals. It's temporary to start putting in the pieces for a program. So we've now been investing in better intelligence and what goes on in the supply chain, and experts who are there kind of working on signals, and then working with companies to kind of handle where we may see a vulnerability, or in fact, dealing with a potential or real shortage. In fact, we have it up with Congress now for a 2022 budget and ask for funding for supply chain, so we can have a permanent program. We really can work with developers and hopefully head things off at the pass, if not deal with them, more effectively, more efficiently when they arise. Because if you're a company and you've been in the midst of any of these shortages or healthcare facilities dealing with, it's an absolute, nightmare.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, we're, Veeva, our goal is to build the industry cloud for life sciences, right? So, quality systems, regulatory, clinical trial systems, right? All those things. And one of the most things that we did quite a bit was innovate on supplier auditing, supplier quality, right? So people were trying to find new supply chain. How do I audit this person remotely when I can't get people out there, right? So it's good to hear about the progress, the funding, first of all, but also the progress that you're helping to support, with the rest of the industry in that space.
Yeah, and you can see our work like advanced manufacturing. Some of the efforts are about also that strengthening what we will say on supply chain too, because as the world got more global, unfortunately, the vulnerabilities increased, as well. And look at semiconductors. Look at the price we've paid because we handed that over to the Chinese.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's the reality of it. And I'm hoping, increasingly people are going to have a bit of that, introspective look to say, what do we need to do to shore up the supply chain so that we are either, should we be sourcing domestically and we got to build up in this country, and what then we're getting from trusted countries and parties where we're going to have more confidence that we won't see the kinds of disruptions that we're dealing with or have been dealing with.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's really interesting to see that 20, 30 year globalization, right? And seeing the impact of that, right, during a pandemic has been great. But this was great. Rachel popped up here, which I think probably means we're running out of time, but thank you so much for your time. Always great to speak with you. And yeah, look forward to the next time.
Same here. Thanks, everyone. Great day.
Thank you both so much. And just to comment on what Dr. Shuren said and make a small plug for Massachusetts, as you look to understand where supply chain is coming from and keep things local. I know the state of Massachusetts has a number of initiatives that they've been working with med device manufacturers on supply chain related, and a number of things that you can take advantage of if you do decide to bring manufacturing back locally. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@massmedic.com if you're curious about talking about that. I know the state would love to hear more from our medical device companies and manufacturers about what the challenges are and where they can be providing assistance and really bringing things back locally. So with that, I have to say, Seth, thank you so much for driving that Q&A. I know we give you a big lift there with Dr. Shuren, so I really appreciate you doing that. And I know you spoke a little bit about what Veeva does, but is there a quick 30-second boilerplate you want to throw in there?
I appreciate it. It's always great to speak with Dr. Shuren. He makes it easy. But first, people can go to this side, right? If you want to find out more, right, go to veeva.com/medtech. But our goal really is to help companies transform and bring products to market, right? Giving them the tools they need, whether that's regulatory information management, clinical data, clinical operations management, managing their claims and commercial content, all these best in breed applications that are within unified suites. But what's really important is it's on a single platform. It's built from scratch on our own platform that's updated 3 times a year. So as the FDA comes out with these great new guidances, right, and a year to go into effect, right, that's 3 releases for us to make sure that those things are available for our customers to use. So it's still focused on how to help bring products to patients, but again, providing that technology backbone and infrastructure to make that a reality. So thank you.
That's perfect. Thanks, Seth. And to all of you, thank you so much for joining us for a full day or full half day program. If you do have questions, I encourage you to reach out to our sponsors, RQM Plus, Veeva Medtech, Covington, and Duane Morris. I know they would love to hear from you and answer any other questions. And as I said, we'll be providing a link to the video and as many of the presentations as our presenters are willing to share. I know Dr. Shuren will absolutely give us his slides, and a few of the others have said yes as well. So we will get those over to you probably in the next 24 hours. So please enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you again at another MassMEDIC virtual program. Bye-bye.